Chapter 484. Freya took a deep breath and walked up to the competition platform. This 10 by 10 square stone platform was specially built for today's competition. It was 1.5 meters above the ground, and it didn't matter if she fell off the platform or if she took the initiative to admit defeat, she would be declared defeated. Freya had already won 2 matches, but the more she progressed, the more powerful her opponents became. To be honest, she didn't have the confidence to continue moving forward. Thinking of this, Freya couldn't help but feel a little vexed. Brando had sent her here so that she could become stronger and protect everyone in the village. But now, she couldn't say that she had achieved this. Compared to those monstrous geniuses, even her original confidence had been ground down a lot. Freya raised her sword. This time, her opponent was an upperclassman. Maynard was watching from the side as usual, but when she saw Freya's state, she couldn't help but frown. You can't win if you're absent-minded. The upperclassman also saw this and couldn't help but remind her. Freya shivered and immediately withdrew her thoughts. She raised her head. For a moment, everything in front of her eyes overlapped with the dream. The red ground stretched endlessly under her feet, and her opponent became the knight who was covered in phosphorescent flames. She couldn't help but shake her head in panic, wanting to get rid of this illusion. But her opponent had already pulled out his sword and was coming towards her. Freya was startled, and couldn't help but think of the scene in her dream. At this moment, she had completely forgotten the essence of swordsmanship, and only subconsciously wanted to retreat. There was a roar of laughter in the stands. Apart from the nobles, there were also the students of the academy. They had never seen anyone run away from a competition in such a sorry state. Freya, what are you doing? Maynard couldn't help but frown and shout in a low voice. But at this time, a white light suddenly flashed on Freya's forehead, and a pair of wings of light stretched out from her back. With a ding sound, it knocked away the sword in the hands of the student. What is that? Beside the princess, several important ministers stood up. They had witnessed the scene in the arena. They only saw a flash of white light, and the sword in the hands of the senior student flew out of his hands. And this was not the end. There was a soft buzzing sound, as if there was a resonance. Suddenly, a white light rose from the distance of the academy. That's the direction of the Song River. Someone among the nobles immediately recognized it. Before he could finish his sentence, everyone saw the rising white light suddenly change direction in midair, drawing a long arc as it headed straight for the academy. This is, under everyone's watchful eyes, the white light landed vertically on the competition stage, right in front of Freya. Then, the white light disappeared, revealing the true body of a stone sword that was inserted into the ground. At this moment, not to mention the others, even the person involved was shocked. Freya had no idea what was going on. She only felt that the sword in front of her seemed to be calling out to her. The voice was so friendly, it was like Brando's gentle encouragement. However, Freya's heart was pounding at this moment. She did not know what to do for a moment. The arena was silent for a moment. Not a single sound could be heard. Phoo, Freya, you have a strange pattern on your forehead. However, Freya suddenly heard Disha calling out to her from below. She subconsciously touched her forehead and felt a piercing pain. She put down her hand and saw that it was covered in blood. Was she injured? How could this be? The girl clearly remembered that there was a flash of white light on her body and that the sword was sent flying. How could she be injured when the sword did not even get close to her? She could not help but raise the shining sword in her hand and look at her forehead. Only then did she realize that there was a beautiful azure emblem on her forehead. What is this? Of course, Freya did not know that this emblem had a famous name in Brando's previous game world. It was the Valkyrie's battle emblem. This was the proof of the glory that Martha gave her in her life. It was the symbol that all the Erewhon players believed in. It was the lighthouse and flag of Erewhon. However, she did not notice it at all. She only felt at a loss. She raised her head in fear and met Maynard's pair of dark and calm eyes. "Pick up that sword. It belongs to you, Freya." Maynard had an indescribably complicated look on her face, but her first sentence was so resolute. Freya was startled. Maynard nodded at her again. The girl took a deep breath and raised her head to look around. Everyone seemed to be holding their breaths as they waited for her next move. She hesitated for a moment before gathering her courage and approaching the stone sword. She held the sword hilt and felt that it was cold. Then, she gently lifted it. Then, a miracle happened. Everyone saw countless rays of golden light shoot out from the stone sword. Then, the rocks that covered the sword fell off one by one, revealing a golden longsword. The sword was more than 3 feet long. The handguard was like a pair of open wings. The Lionheart emblem was on it. The whole sword was brilliant as if it was made of gold. The Lionheart sword. Beside the princess, her teacher, the old man who everyone respected in Erewhon, could not help but shout in surprise. "No, it's not the real Lionheart sword. It's different from the description. It seems that some rules have changed." The half-fairy princess was much calmer. However, when she looked at the sword in Freya's hand, her eyes flashed with an indescribable light. The previous movement seemed to be the awakening of the bloodline, right? She immediately turned around and asked Oberway behind her. "It seems so. The bloodline of the Everton family is not that simple. Pay more attention to her. Just the Lionheart sword alone is enough." Oberway replied, "Speaking of which, the Lionheart sword appeared in the south and recognized a master. This time, the northern barbarians should be panicking. But first, we have to make sure that the little girl is on our side." A noble said with some worry, "If the Lionheart sword falls into the hands of outsiders, don't worry. Freya is a simple girl. I believe that she will stand on our side." Griffin looked at him and replied, "Yes." Oberway looked at the princess. His eyes seemed to have some kind of wisdom that could see through everything. It was as if he was asking, "Is she really on our side, Your Highness?" The half-fairy princess slowly calmed down. She could only smile bitterly in her heart. She thought of the young knight in the story. Indeed, even she could not tell who held Erewhon's future in their hands. Griffin looked at the sword in Freya's hand and could not help but wonder if this was the punishment given by Lady Martha for breaking the oath. But why was he spared? Lady Maynard, the expressionless female knight, turned her head and looked at Freya, who took the initiative to call out to her. She tilted her head as if to ask, "What's the matter?" This sword." Freya felt like she was still dreaming. The sword in her hand was definitely not an ordinary weapon. But why did the sword take the initiative to find her? She was still a little uneasy. "This is yours," Maynard replied. "But, isn't this?" Freya thought of the legend of the Lionheart sword and her heart pounded. She was a pure Erewhon citizen and had grown up listening to those stories. But when she thought of everything that happened in those legends was related to her, whether it was the late King Eric or the Lionheart sword, she felt that it was a little too surreal. "Freya, I used to know a girl who was similar to you. She was as stubborn and strong as you. She also had her own ideals." Maynard looked at the girl and suddenly said, "At that time, I was still young. I had always admired her. I remember that she had a sword that was similar to yours." "Ha!" Freya was stunned. "That sword was sharper than this one, but not as strong as this one." Maynard said, "I think this sword is more suitable for you, Freya. Maybe one day, it will change everything." What do you mean?" "I don't really understand what you mean, Lady Maynard. I mean, don't you want to give it a name?" "But it's the Lionheart sword." That was King Eric's Lionheart sword, but not anymore. Then what do you think it should be called? I don't have a talent for naming things. Freya could not help but feel a little embarrassed. For a moment, Maynard thought that the Lionheart sword in the girl's hand was crying. But she shook her head and sighed. Let's call it Amber. Amber. Yes, Amber, the Amber sword. There is such a sword in the Cruce's Pale poem. It is the legendary sacred sword and the only one of all the sacred swords that allows the wielder to fight against fate. Maynard replied seriously, the previous owner of the Amber sword was the legendary Azure Knight. He pierced through the sky and caused the stars to fall to the earth, thus opening the second era. Freya held the sword in her hand and nodded. I understand, Amber. That's a nice name. The expressionless female knight suddenly felt that Freya was right when she said that she did not have a talent for naming things. But she shook her head and turned to leave. Wait, Lady Maynard, Freya called out again. What happened after that? After that? I'm sorry, I'm talking about the girl you said looked like me. What happened after that? After that? Maynard looked at Freya and smiled. There was no after that. How is that possible? Freya could not help but widen her eyes. But there was indeed no after that. Brando, who was walking in the forest, suddenly felt his heart palpitate. He subconsciously touched the stone slab in his chest. It was vibrating slightly. What's wrong? Quinn noticed his abnormality and asked. It's nothing. Brando shook his head. It was the Lionheart sword. But why would it respond to him at this time? It had been a few months since they last met. The feeling just now was strange. It felt like a contract. Brando felt a familiar aura from the other side. It even felt a little intimate. This feeling was too strange. Not to mention now, even in the game, he had never heard of such a feeling before. But now, he could only suppress these thoughts because the centaur in front of him had cut through a patch of thorns. Then, a wide hilly area appeared in front of him. We're here. Brando took a deep breath. He raised his hand and signaled for the elves and mercenaries behind him to stop. The land in front of them was this legendary young man's territory. Everyone's eyes were fixed on Brando. This farce in Tonagel was about to come to an end. Author's note, the 2 chapters are close to 7,000 words. The cold is getting worse. Alright, I feel like I'm going to die. Or should I say, I'm already dead. This is just a remnant of my will. This will is quite strong. Look, not only can it write, it can also act cute and ask for votes. Hurry up and vote. If you're good enough, there's more tomorrow. Students also, it's New Year, and I forgot to say my best wishes. Let me add a new year. May all lovers be siblings, and the cutest ones must be boys. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 485. Even though the soldiers from the Grizzly Bear domain and the Crus army were able to scale the walls several times, the resistance of the mercenaries far exceeded the expectations of the Erewhon nobles. Their attacks were neutralized at the last moment, and Count Rantner's army was unable to advance for 2 days and 1 night. The battle was extremely intense, and the river of Gree was dyed red with blood. Lord Paulus remained unmoved. The Knight General was like a grim reaper who guarded the entire battlefield, stubbornly maintaining the pace of their advance. At this stage of the war, there was no longer a need to care about the number of lives lost. Victory was just a step away. The experienced general was looking for an opportunity to strike the last blow. Over the past day, the rebel army's geographical advantage had been worn down. On the other hand, the morale of the rebel army was still high. Suddenly, his eyes lit up. Lord Paulus pointed in a certain direction. "Let Lord Wade go up. Don't ask for my orders, he will know where to attack." The messenger was speechless for a moment. "Is this how you pass down orders?" For a moment, the nameless man even suspected that the Count had not slept a wink and was a little dizzy. But when he raised his head, what he saw was a pair of firm and hardy eyes. It was confidence. "I understand, my lord." The messenger bowed. The night-song tiger whistled and gathered the people around him. "Do you see that?" He pointed to a corner of the forest on the other side of the river and asked. Everyone saw a red swallowtail flag appear in that direction, and several spears pierced through the canopy. Then, a whole group of cavalry covered in red armor appeared at the edge of the forest. "The Crimson Banner Cavalry, that's Count Randner's private army." One of the mercenaries immediately recognized them. "How generous!" Another mercenary spat out. His spittle was stained with blood. "How strong are they?" the night-song tiger asked. "Grade 1 troops. Their mounts are ferocious horses, and they are light cavalry. Their average strength is above iron ranked." Beside him, a tall and skinny elf with long ears answered. Unlike the others, he was also one of the mercenaries that Brando summoned. "Humph, a fully armored light cavalry." The night-song tiger clicked his tongue. "The horses are not wearing armor, and they are considered light cavalry in terms of their mobility and weight. They are equipped with the three-eyed muskets of the Hazel people, and they are capable of long-range attacks within a certain distance." "Count Randner must have invested a lot in this army," the elf replied. "Did my lord say that?" the night-song tiger asked softly. The latter nodded. "They want to attack our left flank. The left flank is filled with Cornelius mercenaries, and they are already showing signs of fatigue." The night-song tiger turned around and pointed at the others. "Unfortunately, there's no reason to let our old knight off so easily. We'll deal with the cavalry, what about you?" Other than his own people, he looked at the other mercenaries present. These mercenaries were all elites selected from various regiments. They were at least at the pinnacle of iron rank. There were not many of them, only 40 to 50 of them. A day ago, there were still 100 people in this squadron. The intensity of the battle was evident. Killing one is enough. Everyone chuckled. More and more cavalrymen poured out from the forest on the other side of the river, and soon, there were 200 to 300 of them. Wade sat on his horse and looked at his subordinates with satisfaction. This was the model of Erwin's most elite troops, and they were not inferior to the White Lion Legion of the royal family. Even though there were only 2 squadrons in this battle, he was confident that he could lead them to defeat any enemy that stood in their way. The cavalrymen whistled as they crossed the river. Of course, their sudden appearance attracted Medicia's attention. The Silver Fairy Princess was standing at the highest point of the battlefield. Following her gaze, a rain of arrows rained down on the cavalrymen as if they were an extension of her will. The arrows fell into the river and splashed fiercely, but it was difficult for bows and arrows to deal fatal damage to the cavalrymen. The conical arrows would lose their momentum after passing through the deck, and some of the cavalrymen were still able to maintain their formation with 3 or 4 arrows. Wade was not surprised by this, as equipment was an important measure of an army's strength. The Crimson Banner cavalrymen were equipped with breastplates that greatly reduced the damage of long-range attacks. In his opinion, this was the greatest weakness of light cavalry. However, the noble knight did not expect that his enemies would be so diverse. The mercenaries were originally mixed, and the adventurers came from all over the world. Wade was just feeling proud of himself, but he did not know that the elven archers in the forest had already locked onto the cavalrymen. "Hanno, you take the left, I'll take the right." On a branch about 100 or 200 meters away, an elf covered in grass held a long bow and handed a green arrow to a human ranger behind him. Those two. Two bowstrings sounded in the forest. The Crimson Banner cavalrymen had just entered the forest on the south coast when the two leading figures fell off their horses like logs. Knight Wade was shocked. When he turned around, he realized that his two subordinates had been shot by the arrows at their throats. They had died on the spot. He felt his hair stand on end. He turned around and shouted, "Godly archers, be careful." A true sharpshooter was the nightmare of all heavy-armored units. That was because their heavy armor was as good as nothing to them. Their armor-piercing arrows could always hit the weakest and most fatal part of the enemy's body. However, in a normal army, professional archers were already precious, not to mention sharpshooters who could shoot from 100 paces away. Lords would often spend a lot of money to hire such people. However, Wade knew that the truly powerful sharpshooters were mostly elves and rangers. These people loved freedom more than anything else. Thinking of this Sir Knight couldn't help cursing in his heart. Where did these damn rebels come from? There were druids, rangers, and even elves. Was this the Forest Alliance? Or were they actually fighting a holy war? Once he thought of the November War, he couldn't help feeling a chill run down his spine. Over there. The Crimson Banner cavalrymen kept moving forward in the forest. Moving within the range of a godly archer was life. These cavalrymen were all experienced soldiers, so they naturally understood this. Very quickly, they found traces of the enemy. Not far away, there was a figure quickly moving on a dark brown wall reinforced by vines. The slender elf with greenish-gray skin buried his head behind the battlements and maintained his position. He quickly approached the group of knights. The elf stopped to observe as a cold glow appeared in his narrow eyes. Then he kept moving while half his body came out from behind the wall, raising his bow. "It's an elven archer." The cavalrymen screamed when they saw the other side's posture. They immediately took out their shields from their saddles and raised them to block their throats. For children, the elven archers were godly archers from fairy tales, but for soldiers on the battlefield, the elven archers were a nightmare. Especially the blue and gray-skinned wind elves, wilderness runners. In a well-hidden trench not far away, the Nightsong Tiger peeked his head out to look before coming back in. He made a hand gesture to the others, "They're all veterans. It's a pity it's no use, hey, hey." A cruel smile flashed through the eyes of the mercenaries, which seemed to have turned gray due to years of killing, and they really began to laugh. It was indeed useless. With a flash of white light, the arrow actually pierced through the center of the round shield in the hands of the leading cavalryman. It then pierced through the neck of this unlucky fellow before hitting the breastplate of the cavalryman behind him with a spray of blood. With a loud bang, the second cavalryman was sent flying off his horse. Then, the first cavalryman fell off his horse without a sound. A silver-tier archer. For a moment, Wild thought that he had fallen into a huge trap. The green-gray figure on the wall had stopped. He was now a cannon, but to Wild, he was more like the Grim Reaper. Every time the green-gray elf raised his bow, at least one of the Crimson Banner cavalrymen in the forest would fall off their horses. Wade only felt that his scalp was in trouble, but he was still an excellent commander after all. He immediately drew his saber and waved it forward, ordering resolutely. "Get close, use your handguns to suppress that bastard." The killing power of a silver-ranked archer was too terrifying. By the time he finished firing 2 arrows in a second, the morale of his troops would have collapsed. The whistling of arrows in the forest was like a divine talisman, but at this moment, the Crimson Banner cavalry displayed their strength as elites. Even in such a situation, the cavalry still maintained their high morale and charged forward. Furthermore, they were about to enter the firing range of the handguns. Wade heaved a sigh of relief. He ordered the cavalrymen to raise their spears and let the Crimson Banner flutter in the forest. Victory seemed to be right in front of them. As long as they went around the defensive line, they would be able to deal a decisive blow to the rebels. But it was a pity that victory could only be seen from afar. The night-song tiger snapped his fingers. It's our turn to show off. The uneven ground of the forest was covered with fallen leaves and snow. However, at this moment, a row of scarecrows suddenly stood up from the fallen leaves. Of course, they were not scarecrows, but mercenaries in disguise. Wade's heart skipped a beat and sank. It's a knight. The Crimson Banner cavalryman panicked. The night-song tiger licked his lips and took a step forward, throwing an axe that was spinning rapidly in the air. Time seemed to have stopped. The night-song tiger watched as one of the cavalrymen fell to the ground, while the other cavalryman raised his spear and swept past him. The night-song tiger dodged the attack and raised his sword, opening a long wound on the cavalryman's waist. Rose-colored blood and warm white mist formed a string of sparkling pearls in the air. The cavalryman cried out in pain and used the momentum of his horse to charge forward a few steps before falling to the ground. Wade looked at the scene in horror. It was indeed a knight, at least the ones at the front were at least silver-ranked. Hope was like a fragile crystal statue that fell to the ground and shattered into pieces. Fuck the rebels. The noble knight suddenly felt a little sad, but he did not retreat and raised his sword. The knight's eyes flashed with determination as he charged towards the night-song tiger. Die. A long arrow pierced through his throat. On the wall, the elf put away his bow. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 486. The Crimson Banner riders were torn apart in the forest, and the crimson-red swallowtail flags fell one after another. Lord Paulus' side was completely silent. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the hilt of his sword tightly. This is the mercenaries of Lopez mentioned in the intelligence report. They actually endured until now. The old knight closed his eyes, and his wrinkled face revealed a deep sense of fatigue. Lord Wade was a young man he admired, but there was no room for regret in war. Erwin had already lost too much blood. When he opened his eyes again, there was only a cold determination left in them. Since the rebels had revealed their trump card, the outcome of the battle had already been decided. Let the knights of Ranner go forth and add to your glory. He waved his hand, as if he had completely handed over the victory to the youths. The knights and silver-ranked warriors from Ranner cheered in unison. However, the cheers did not evoke any joy in Lord Paulus' heart. Erwin had already fallen asleep, and just like him, the old man's gaze pierced through the dusk, as if he had already seen the thick darkness. When was there ever a time when even victory could not bring forth the color of hope? His eyes could only see the thick color of blood. What went wrong? The knights are moving. A cold voice rang in Yutta's ears. She turned around and saw Medish's unchanging expression. The little elven girl was quite cute when she pulled a long face. She even had the aura of an elven royal, a princess general. Yutta nodded. Victory and defeat were decided in a single thought, and even she could see it clearly. However, she could not see the opportunity for victory. The previous battle had consumed a lot of her stamina, and even in front of the fairy princess, she could not maintain her composure. Just like the defensive line, anyone could see that it was on the verge of collapse. However, Yutta could not help but look at Medisha in front of her in confusion. She wondered if it was the pride of the elves, or some unknown confidence that supported this little girl to be able to maintain her composure in such a situation. But where did her confidence come from? The female mercenary captain panted slightly. For the first time, she did not care about the anxious eyes of her own people behind her. She turned around and asked piously, "How should we deal with it?" A woman's pride forced her to not lower her head. She wanted to see where this general's confidence came from. She was clearly a child, so how could she understand everything on the battlefield? Did this elven girl really understand what she was facing? Yutta was very suspicious. However, Medisha was very clear-headed. "Blow," she said. Yuta looked at the fairy princess in disbelief. Even though she was covered in silver armor, she still looked like a childish general. "What about Madara?" Blowing the horn was a signal to mobilize the subterranean dwellers, but it was no secret that the subterranean dwellers were the last of Madara's forces. Both sides on the battlefield knew this. The subterranean dwellers were the last reserves of both sides on the battlefield, and whoever sent in their reserves first would lose the war. Medisha looked at her and calmly grabbed the spear beside her. "Prepare the horses for me. I want to lead them myself." Yuta was suddenly speechless. She grabbed Medisha's shoulder and said, "My people can't die with you, what about you?" Medisha tilted her head and asked. Yuta took a deep breath and nodded. "I'll go with you, little girl." Medisha smiled. When the long horn sounded in the forest, it was like an ancient ballad. Both sides of the battle seemed to feel the vastness of the ancient forest. Dragon horns and trombones. Lord Paulus suddenly felt that time had turned back, and he had returned to the days of war. On the battlefield of the Holy War, there was only blood for blood. The old alliance was no longer there. It was a war without glory, but it was a medal of honor for the veterans. Lord Paulus licked his dry lips. "It's the subterranean dwellers. The subterranean dwellers have appeared. Are they going to fight to the death? These rebels are really worthy of respect. Where did they come from? Yes, where did these people come from?" The old knight suddenly felt a little doubtful. These were not ordinary rebels. These were the best of Erewhon's warriors. But why did the best of Erewhon's people always have his own blood flowing in them? The old knight suddenly had the desire to meet the young man called Brando. He couldn't help but think that perhaps one day, the Erewhon's people would be united again. But who would be the one to make this happen? Would it be the dukes in the north, or would it be the isolated princess? Lord Paulus felt that he might not be able to see that day. He closed his eyes, as if trying to find the footprints of King Eric in his dreams. "Sir?" the surrounding knight asked hesitantly. "Inform Madara." Lord Paulus's closed eyes never opened again. The old knight answered tiredly. The knight nodded and retreated. But at this time, there was a sudden cheer in the forest. "What's wrong?" Lord Paulus squinted his eyes and looked over. His personal knight also turned around at the same time. The cheers came from the camp of the Mage Corps. Those guys seemed to be celebrating something. The old knight frowned unhappily. It seems that the wizards have discovered that the forest on the other side is not entirely real. A large part of the forest behind is an illusion. They have been trying to find a way to get rid of this illusion. They finally found a way just now. A messenger immediately replied. Lord Paulus snorted softly. A group of 30 mages did not do anything in the previous battle, causing him to lose a lot of talented young men. Although those guys in robes had explained that it was because they were fighting against a wizard in the opposing camp who was far more powerful than them, the old knight always thought that it was just an excuse. A wizard who was more powerful than them. Wouldn't that be a gold-ranked wizard? How could there be such a talent in the rebel army? Sure enough, those guys who were mumbling could not be trusted. Lord Paulus couldn't help but think. But at this time, they were still doing something important. Even though he suspected that they were trying to take the credit, it was not convenient for him to say anything. He just nodded to show that he understood. However, he did not expect the wizards to act so quickly. Soon, the sound of chanting could be heard from the forest below. Following that, a huge magic fluctuation caused even the ordinary soldiers in the forest to feel their hair stand on end. If even the ordinary people could feel the magic fluctuation, it naturally could not escape the eyes of a true professional spellcaster. In fact, when the wizards on Count Randner's side cast their spells, the Shire had already sensed the commotion on the other side. However, the young wizard looked at the acolyte who came to ask for his instructions and shook his head. "Don't worry about it. Let them dismantle it. Let them dismantle it." The acolyte was puzzled. "Nonsense, that thing is used to scare people. What's the use of it when the war has already progressed to this stage? Those idiots like to waste their magic. Just let them be. How low do you have to be to go crazy with those idiots?" The Shire immediately showed an expression of disappointment. He tapped the acolyte's forehead. "Wizards need to use their brains more in a battle. Do you understand?" The acolyte was scolded badly and hurriedly nodded. In fact, the Shire was definitely not the best choice as a mentor. At least in terms of patience, this young wizard's acolyte could not even compare to his master. He then looked at all the wizards and apprentices in robes below and shook his head. "Don't say I didn't warn you. Save as much mana as you can to prepare for the final battle. I didn't bring you here to let you die here." Of course, the Shire shrugged. "If a person wants to die of stupidity, then there's nothing I can do about it." As soon as he finished speaking, a much louder cheer came from the forest. Everyone turned to look at the north bank of the Gree River. This time, the cheers came from Count Randner, Lord Paulus, the Grizzly Bear territory, and the ordinary soldiers of Cross. Even the Highlanders were cheering. This was because the illusion of the forest was disappearing. This was good news for everyone in Count Randner's army. It seemed to indicate the arrival of the final victory. Their enemies had lost their last barrier. Tarkus and his Black Knight Guard stood in the forest like shadows. Their golden pupils shone with a cold light, as if the outcome of this battle, or even the battle itself, had nothing to do with them. Behind them were thousands of undead soldiers. As they did not need to breathe, the entire army was silent like a steel wall. The one-eyed general's gaze fell on the subterrane dwellers who were covered in thick armor. "Subterrane dwellers," he said as he put down the gauntlet and turned around. "This is the trump card of those humans. Let's go. I want a Madara-style victory, for the Emperor." The Black Knight unsheathed their shiny scimitars and replied in a low voice, "With the will of the Mercury Staff." But it was at this moment that the sound of a horn rang out from the forest. It was a long sound that lingered in the forest. Tarkus stopped. He seemed to be listening to the horn. "It's the assault horn. They dare to attack." Lord Paulus suddenly shut his mouth. The cheering soldiers of Count Randner also shut their mouths. Because behind the melting forest, they actually saw something that shouldn't belong there. "All troops, pay attention. An unfamiliar army has appeared on the left flank." The enemy did not respond to the signal. It might be the enemy. The shouts of the messengers echoed one after another. When Brando parted the layers of branches in front of him, he saw such a scene. Rows of elven archers on Pegasi appeared on both sides of him. He turned around and glanced at Quinn. "Where do you think their great chieftain is? You humans should call him a general, right? I think he's on that mountain." "I'm just saying that because when in Rome, do as the Romans do." Brando looked at the tree elf leader in surprise. "We don't have a great chieftain either. You're talking about the orcs." Quinn gritted his teeth. "Something like that." Brando shrugged as he looked at the undulating forest and the river Gree that was almost dyed red, "but I don't think Lord Paulus is stupid enough to expose himself in such an obvious place. That might be the base of one of his night lords." He thought for a moment, "but it's something like that. As a surprise, I think it's enough." Brando turned his head again. "Scouts, have you cleared the enemy's whistle?" "Yes," a centaur immediately replied, "but my lord, but we found a hunter's hut, a hunter's hut. P.S. I still have a cold, and I even had a few nosebleeds yesterday. What a tragedy. Anyway, it's 2 chapters again. Students, keep voting, keep up the good work, and I'll update 2 chapters again tomorrow. Also, to answer a few questions, some of the students in the comments section said that the background and setting are difficult to understand. How should I put it? As a self-created world, there must be a lot of background and culture. If I were to write these into a book, I'm afraid it would take up to 1 million words. First of all, you won't have the time to read it all. Second, I'm sure I won't be able to handle it. Rather than that, it's better to spread it out bit by bit. If you feel that you don't understand some of the settings, you can choose to skip them and just treat them as background. I'll also explain the important settings in detail. You may not understand them at first, but you'll understand them after a while. Second, Freya's sword isn't the real Amber sword. It's just a name. Maynard hopes to use the sword's will to fight against Erwin's fate. Also, yesterday on Tiabar, someone asked if Maynard had transmigrated. I didn't answer this question because I thought that many people would want to know the answer to this question. I won't say much about the plot, but I can tell you with certainty that she didn't transmigrate. To be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 487. Most of the residents in remote areas such as Tonajol and Usong did not live near the city. Even in Wonde, the more prosperous the area, the higher the degree of urbanization. Probably because of trade and other reasons, there were a large number of craftsmen, monks, artists, city officials, and their relatives, as well as people who relied on these people to live in the city. But in Tonajol, the situation was reversed. There were many scattered settlements in the wilderness. Farms were scattered around the edges of the forest, and there were hunters' huts in the hills. The centaurs discovered this situation, and there was a family living in the hut. They were afraid that they were Count Randner's scouts, so they brought them along. The leaves on the trees rustled softly. The centaur warriors were tall and strong, with reddish-brown muscles, and purple and white battle tattoos on their cheeks and shoulders. They brought along trembling men and women with them, as well as their children. Their clothes were tattered, and their black hair was greasy and tangled. They looked like refugees. Brando glanced down the mountain. The forest was as dark as ink, and flags of different colors intertwined with each other, but the sounds of battle were silenced. The entire battlefield came to a standstill because of their sudden appearance. He noticed that the soldiers of Krus were secretly adjusting their formation, and the grayish-green nobles' private soldiers were faintly discernible in the forest. But he did not mind and turned back. They are not scouts, just refugees. My lord, we. The man's eyes flashed with fear. Refugees who were caught by the nobles were usually beheaded. There were many headless corpses on the road from Dowling to Summer. Most of them were refugees, while the rest were bandits. Who are you? The child broke free from his mother's pale hands and asked loudly. The sudden appearance of the army on the flanks caused Lord Paulus to feel uneasy. However, when he heard that there were only a few hundred of them, he heaved a sigh of relief. His index finger tapped on the smooth hilt of his sword as he turned around and asked, "Any response from the scouts?" "No." Lord Paulus nodded. Only a few hundred people dared to appear. The old knight heard the knights beside him discussing in a relaxed tone. The soldiers seemed to be mocking the enemy for overestimating their strength. Even though an arrogant army was bound to lose, there was no general who did not like a confident army. He was very satisfied with the morale of his subordinates. The enemy's reinforcements seemed to have become a laughingstock. The reinforcements are stopping. He's probably considering whether to retreat or flee. Coward, if you had caught us off guard when you first appeared, you might have been able to catch us off guard. What a waste of time. To be able to circle around our flank, they must be quite capable. That's because Krus is too incompetent. Lord Paulus couldn't help but shake his head. Who would consider the enemy? His subordinates were a little too arrogant. He took a deep breath and replied, "If there's no response, then they're enemies. Have the Crus men stop them. They've already lost enough face. The morale of the army could be used. Then let's go." The old knight pulled down his mask and stood up from the rock. His attendants had already brought his warhorse to him, and his knights were already ready to go. Even the slightest change on the battlefield could not change his decision. Although Lord Paulus was cautious, he had the decisiveness of a general. He nodded to the attendant, and the metal armor clanked as it rubbed against each other. The attendant in leather armor picked up the horn hanging at his waist and blew it. A clear battle cry pierced through the forest. Then, countless soldiers walked out of the forest. They were dressed in red and blue battle robes, with iron helmets on their heads and long swords on their waists. They held eagle shields in one hand, and their iron gauntlets made cracking sounds as they stepped on the dead wood. The small groups of soldiers converged into a torrent, as if they had filled up all the gaps in the forest. The noble's private army was arranged in a few huge square formations. Like water flowing slowly through the battlefield, the scattered arrows were thrown into the formation. Even if one of the soldiers fell, the soldiers behind would immediately fill the gap. The enemies in front of them seemed endless, and it made them feel helpless. The army was approaching. The mercenaries who were still resisting in the forest couldn't help but put down the bows in their hands. The appearance of an army of tens of thousands was enough to make the earth tremble. Everyone swallowed a mouthful of saliva. Medisha was dressed in silver armor and sat on her unicorn. Her helmet was sealed, and only her eyes, small nose, and mouth were exposed. The fairy princess pursed her lips and held onto her long shuttle as she watched the scene in front of her without saying a word. Behind her were Yude, Rabin, and nearly 1,000 subterrane dwellers. The subterrane dwellers were hunched over, covered in black and spiked armor. They held huge spears in their hands like war monsters. However, this army did not block the path of Count Randner's army. Medisha was silently watching the battle. Yude did not understand. Are we not going to attack? They are not our enemy, Yude. I never said that our target was not Madara. Medisha looked at the distant mountain and replied. This. But they can't stop us. The female mercenary leader looked at the approaching army with slight nervousness. My lord has his own plans. Medisha looked back at her and smiled slightly. Her calm eyes were filled with unquestionable trust. You're too nervous. My lord doesn't have many people with him. Yude looked at Medisha strangely. Enough. Medisa said, I'm the main commander of this reserve force. First of all, I have to obey the tactical arrangements. My lord said he can do it, so I have to believe in his judgment. Our target is Madara. I think I'm crazy. Yude shook her head and muttered. Medisha smiled. Thank you for accompanying me, Yude. You're just a little girl. Yude sighed and thought of her sister. She touched her sword and suddenly felt that her hand was a little cold. Brando looked at the thin boy. The mother ran over and protected her child in fear. She raised her head and looked at him with pleading eyes. My lord, the enemy is moving. At this time, one of the mercenaries said. Brando nodded and looked back. I'm your rightful lord. No matter if you're refugees or my people, as long as you live in Tanajul, I will protect you. Just remember this, and that's enough. After that, he pulled the reins and was about to leave. But at this time, to everyone's surprise, the child loudly retorted, Liar, you're all bad people. Brando was startled and could not help but stop. Father said that if you weren't here, there wouldn't be a war. My lord. The man pulled his son with an uneasy expression. Brando shook his head and looked back at the people he brought out of the Black Forest. Everyone was also looking at him, the tree elves, the centaurs, the druids, and the human mercenaries. Brando nodded at them, then jumped off the horse and pulled out his sword in front of everyone's eyes. The poor woman suddenly let out a frightened scream, but Brando walked to her side and held her skinny hand. He gently shook his head and comforted her. "It's okay, don't worry." The woman and the man looked at him nervously. He turned back and patted the little boy's face. "You're a little man, let me ask you a question." The little boy stared at him. "If one day, someone wanted to take your parents away from you, what would you do?" "If they dare, I'll beat them," the little boy answered confidently. "Well said." Brando praised. "Then let me ask you, little man, if one day someone wants to take you away from me, take away this country, guess what I'll do?" The little boy looked at him with a puzzled expression. "I'll beat them up too." Brando smiled faintly. He got up on his horse and pointed his sword forward. Count Rander's army was moving in the forest, but the two armies were still looking at each other from afar. The situation in Tonajol, and even the whole of Erewhon, seemed to be gathering into this final confrontation. Who will be able to change the fate of the kingdom? Brando looked forward, but turned his head. "So you all heard it? Beat them up." The mercenaries roared in response. "Beat them up." The centaur's blood was boiling. This was the life they pursued. They chased after glorious battles until the last drop of blood was shed. Perhaps war itself was meaningless, but the most precious thing between faith and hope was always worthy of respect. The tree elves placed their bows in front of their chests and sang the war song that was widely spread between the humans and elves in the early years. The eagle Zhangyu, bow and crossbow high, light triumphs over darkness, hope protects faith. It was an ancient song that was spread before the War of the Holy Saints. At that time, the intelligent beings of the land were still able to unite against the dark dragon and sign a sacred and solemn oath. But in the blink of an eye, 1,000 years had passed. Brando and Quinn looked at each other and smiled. "How do we fight?" the leader of the tree elves asked. "You will stop Count Randner's army," Brando replied casually. "Since Lord Paulus wants Crust to stop me, I will crush his left wing." These nobles always like to look down on people, and I hope they will remember this lesson from today onwards. "You alone?" Quinn looked at him in surprise. "Me alone." Brendel shook his head with a smile. He turned his head, put his index finger and thumb to his lips, and blew a long whistle. The whistle traveled far and wide in the dark coniferous forest, and everyone on both sides could hear it. The forest suddenly became quiet. Suddenly, a wolf's howl could be heard from afar. A moment later, howls echoed through the forest. The distant howls seemed to be approaching at an astonishing speed. In just a moment, the howls seemed to be right next to their ears. The earth began to tremble as if 10,000 horses were galloping. Lord Paulus pulled on the reins of his warhorse and stopped. The old knight's expression changed slightly under his iron mask. All the knights around him also stopped and turned their heads towards the direction of the howls. It was a pack of wolves, and not just any wolves. The people who lived at the edge of the Black Forest naturally knew what kind of creature the howls came from. Black wolves. The first to panic were the mountain people. They had lived in the wilderness for generations, and there were countless legends about these terrifying creatures. There was only one thing they could think of at this moment. The wolf tide. The wolf tide is coming. The old knight's face turned pale. Quinn looked at Brando, who was standing alone in the midst of the galloping wolves like a knife. It was as if he was looking at a mythical wolf herder. Brando turned his head and smiled at him. "Is that enough?" Quinn did not say a word. He raised his bow and gestured for the tree elves to attack. In an instant, countless Pegasi soared into the sky from the forest. Author's note: my cold is slightly better, but I have to go out to get some medicine, so I'll stop here for today. Tomorrow, Brando will start his killing spree. You know, maybe I'll give him a little boost. Also, those comments in the book reviews section that said, "I'll combine my breasts," please have some self-respect. Can you be any more vulgar? Brando felt that the Lionheart was indeed a divine weapon, and the Lionheart was indeed a fantasy weapon. As for the reason, I'll leave it to you to guess. Also, mothering, I found out that you were talking bad about me in the book review section. The Nightwing staff is a bug in itself. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 488. The Black Wolf Overlord was running at the front. Its fur was black and as hard as steel spikes. Its eyes seemed to be burning with green flames, making it look like a demon that had just been born in hell. As it ran, its 4 feet landed on the ground, and its sharp claws and teeth shone with a cold light. It ran wildly on the withered leaves in the forest. The soldiers could not catch up with its speed. They could only watch as it ran from another mountain to the valley, and then from the valley to the forest on the other side. All the arrows landed behind it, and they could only watch as it approached. The herald trembled as he ordered the soldiers to put down their spears. However, Krus's noble soldiers retreated in waves, and visible ripples appeared on the battlefield. Krus and his knights were supposed to supervise the battle, but the calamity of wolves was the nightmare of Tonajul and the people of the forest for generations. The dark shadows in the forest were the signs of the end of the world. The knights' faces turned pale. Why did we encounter these things? Krus cursed. Krus's soldiers were still able to hold their ground, but the mountain people were even more afraid of the calamity of wolves. Some of the tribes at the back had secretly dispersed, and the tribes at the front were also in a mess. This was a fear that had been ingrained in their hearts since childhood. Once it spread, it would be like a disaster falling from the sky. Even the bravest warriors would lose their courage and throw away their armor. The black wolves were less than 100 steps away from the front of the formation. The archers' projectiles had no effect on them. Krus was a gold-ranked warrior, and his eyesight was excellent. He could see that the soft arrows could not even penetrate the fur of the black wolves. The army behind him was moving forward. The Grey Bear Lord was cunning and indecisive. He could not rely on him. He could only order his soldiers to move forward. Men could not outrun the black wolves, and neither could horses. Krus had lived in the south for 30 years, and he knew this very well. The cold air in the forest was oppressive, but the coldness in the heart was even colder. There were only a few hundred black wolves, and they looked like colts. They were so fast that it seemed like there was no end to them. His palms were sweating, and it condensed on the hilt of his sword. It was as if his breathing had stopped. However, a young knight ran out of the forest first. Brando raised his head. Krus first thought that it was one of his scouts, but then he realized that it was not. The young man raised his head and looked at him. The two of them looked at each other from a distance, but he felt as if he had been completely seen through. "Who are you?" Krus had a bad feeling. "Lord Krus, do you still dream of turning back on the battlefield of Canner? You lost your honor on the battlefield, and I've brought it back to you." Brando's words made him cry out loudly. His face was deathly pale, as if he had fallen into the deepest nightmare. Lord Krus pointed a trembling finger at Brando and stammered, You. 20 years ago, he abandoned his comrades on the battlefield and fled. He thought that no one knew about it, but today, a young man had exposed him. Brando didn't say anything. He didn't mean to mock the other party. Just as he said, he only wanted to bring back the lost glory for the other party. Behind him, the pack of black wolves surged out like a tide. Horses and wolves were creatures that opposed each other, but Brando, who was riding on a horse, was able to stand tall in the middle of the pack of wolves without moving at all. This strange scene made people feel even more terrified. Then, the black wolf collided with the noble soldiers of Cross. It was as if black paint had blended into the gray-green battle line. At that moment, time seemed to slow down. The spears that were placed horizontally on the body of the black wolf, but even the metal spears couldn't penetrate the hard fur of the black wolf, let alone the rock deck below. The spears were bent and cracked along the grain. Crack! 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 The broken wood chips caused a cloud of smoke to rise from the first line of defense. Most of the noble soldiers of Cross were only at the white rank. Most of the officers in the infantry were only at the iron rank, so how could they be a match for the silver-ranked black wolves? The first line of defense formed by thousands of infantrymen was pierced through in an instant, turning into a sieve full of holes. The human soldiers began to retreat, mixed with cries and screams. Lord Cross seemed to have just woken up from his nightmare. He immediately ordered his knight to stabilize the second line of defense. The knight's strength was at the silver rank. As soon as they entered the formation, they took over the command and tried to stabilize the morale of the soldiers with the help of the common soldiers. However, the Cross formation had already begun to collapse towards the center. The wolves tore a huge hole in the middle, and the center of the hole was pointed towards Lord Cross, who was at the top of the mountain. Perhaps it was because of Brando's words, the knight of Count Randner did not retreat. He held his long sword and silently watched the development of the battle below. The knight's orders were to enter the two flanks, and the two flanks that suffered the least attacks from the black wolves quickly stabilized. The Cross soldiers gradually realized that the number of black wolves was actually not that high. After a commotion, the soldiers began to attempt to surround them from the back. Did they give up on the main formation? What a bold decision. Brando raised his head and looked at Lord Cross from afar. The distance between them was less than a kilometer. This distance was neither close nor far in the battlefield of Wonde, and it could be said that it was a test of the courage and wisdom of the commanders on both sides. Lord Cross stood there motionlessly, looking at him. He actually wanted to use himself as a stake to surround him and the wolves. Such courage did not surprise Brando, because he had already expected this. In just a short moment, the wolves were completely surrounded. 200 black wolves and more than 100 iron-ranked shadow rock beasts were facing 10 times the number of human soldiers. Retreating was no longer an option. Both sides were competing to see who would achieve victory first. Brando raised Halran Gaia. The wolves automatically opened up a path for him. The Pegasus he was riding on seemed to feel its master's urging and began to accelerate. His mount was not an ordinary Pegasus, but a gift from the tree elves. This Pegasus was a spirit of nature with the silver blood flowing through its veins. It was the descendant of the holy horse Kaliner, a silver seed, a mythical creature on the same level as the unicorn. It was stronger and faster than the average Pegasus, and it had the ability to control plants and the wind. Brendel was riding on the wings of the wind, flying with the wind. Like an elongated white line, there were no more wolves in front of him. Instead, there were pale-faced human soldiers with spears in their hands. Brando drew an arc with the sword in his hand, as if 7 swords had appeared at the same time. Clang! 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 More than 10 spears were sent flying by him. Brando stretched out his left hand and shouted, "Gale, grant me authority." This was the elementalist's second circle wind spell, Beam Current. The burst of air erupted in a scattered manner, creating a hurricane behind Brando. He moved forward, and the wall of wind also moved forward. The soldiers in front of him were pushed away, forming a hemispherical human wall. The human wall dispersed in midair, and these unlucky fellows fell far into the crowd. The Black Wolf Lord walked side by side with its master. It was born with the strength of a peak silver tear, and after its stone transformation, its shoulder armor, forehead, and back grew a ribbon-like rock plate, greatly increasing its strength and defense. At this moment, it was already close to the early gold tier. Ordinary soldiers could not get close to it at all. Its howl alone was enough to make a group of people weak in the knees. One man and one wolf, in the blink of an eye, opened up a 50-meter-long path in the crowd. Behind them, the pack of black wolves followed, widening the passage. But two knights came out from the side, one on the left and one on the right, trying to block Brando's path. Brando waved Halran Gaia in his hand, and with a flash of sword light, the upper body of the two knights and the head of the warhorse flew high into the air. An instant kill of a silver tier. At this moment, all the nobles who were rushing forward were terrified and stopped in their tracks. This was a gold tier battle, and it was no longer a battle that mortals like them could participate in. Brendel urged his horse forward again, and the enemy's soldiers actually retreated to open up a path for him. It was a strange sight, as though they had switched sides on the battlefield. Lord Cross's face also changed. Such a young gold tier, he was definitely one of Erwin's most talented geniuses. And this was not even the early gold tier. Seeing Brando's elemental domain shining with light, Lord Cross felt the hope in his heart turn to ice. What the hell is going on, these rebels? But Brando saw that Lord Cross still had no intention of moving, and he understood. He looked around, and saw that there were two gold tier fluctuations in the crowd. Sure enough, there was an ambush, and there were more than two gold tiers. He looked at the two swordsmen who were charging towards him. They were both at the beginning of the gold level, unfamiliar faces. They were either secretly trained or hired. Of course, the great aristocrats were rich. Brando did not show any signs of nervousness. He continued to charge forward, raising his sword and slashing at the first gold-tier swordsman charging at him. He did not hold back in the slightest as he charged forward with his horse. His sword was like a shooting star, moving forward with an indomitable will. The gold-tier swordsman from the Ranner family was scared out of his wits. He had never seen such a crazy person, who completely gave up on defense even though he knew it was a 1 versus 2 battle. This sword strike was clearly, "I'll give you a stab even if I have to give up my life." It was not a technical move, but it was enough to make people go crazy. But of course, he did not want to die together with Brando, but the sword was too fast, and he could not dodge it in time. He could only raise his sword to parry. He was already extremely depressed in his heart. Originally, he had taken the initiative to attack first, but he was suppressed by the other party's crazy fighting style. He could only hope that his companion would be able to catch Brando's desperate attack. They had worked together for many years, and would not let go of such an obvious opportunity. However, what happened next caught him by surprise. Brando's sword clashed with his sword, and the huge force almost broke his hand. The swordsman staggered backward, cursing in his heart as he tried to regain his balance. But when he looked up, he saw that Brando did not seem to need to find his center of gravity again, and the sword was already coming at him perfectly. The swordsman was shocked out of his wits. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 489. How is this possible? The gold-ranked swordsman's eyes nearly popped out of their sockets when he saw Brendel's attack. Brendel had used up all of his strength to execute a perfect attack, and if a normal person did not manage to land a blow like that, they would be in a state of paralysis. But Brendel did not even bother to pull back his sword, and immediately followed up with another attack. No matter how he looked at it, it was a strike that used up all of his strength. There was almost no difference between this strike and the previous one. It was a complete reversal of the laws of physics. It was as if two people had struck out at the same time. The gold-tier swordsman from the Diener family could not comprehend it, and he did not need to. If he did not raise his sword to block the strike, he would have to say goodbye to this world. However, he could imagine that if he tried to block the strike, he would be smashed to the ground. he did not even have the time to regain his balance. But he could not care about that at this moment. The gold-tier swordsman from the Diener family wanted to cry, but no tears came out. He did not know what was going on and could only raise his sword. Then, with a loud bang, Brendel was sent flying along with his sword. It was as if he was swatting a dead fly as he fell to the ground. The 2 strikes were completed in an instant. In the eyes of the bystanders, Brando seemed to have transformed into 2 figures and slapped the swordsman to the ground as if he was teaching a child a lesson. It was at this moment that the swordsman's companion arrived. In fact, the second swordsman who had just arrived was also going crazy. If it was any other time, the difference of a few tenths of a second would not have much of an effect. But this time, when the second swordsman arrived, he discovered that Brendel's third sword was already on its way to his fallen comrade. It was as though the second sword had not returned, and the third sword was already on its way. If he could, the swordsman from Count Ayre's family wanted to bang his head on the ground and bawl out loud, "This bastard is using a cheat." But he did not have the time to do so. He realized that if he did not act now, his companion would really die. Even though he was also a gold-tier swordsman, he did not even have the chance to retaliate before he was forced to retreat. This was unacceptable. He immediately drew his sword. In theory, Brando's 3 consecutive strikes meant that he had given up all his defense and attacked his companion with all his might. Even if he did not seize the opportunity to seize the opportunity, he would at least be able to achieve his goal of attacking Brando. However, the swordsman from the Diener family vomited blood when he saw Brando completely ignoring him and stabbing his sword into the heart of the swordsman who was lying on the ground with an expression of disbelief. The expression on the face of the swordsman saying, "Do you hate me that much? Do you not care for your own life?" But at the same time, he saw Brendel's sword slashing towards him. A perfect slash with all his strength. This is impossible. The swordsman from the Diener family almost dropped his sword and screamed as he clutched his head. But regardless of whether it was possible or not, Brando's sword accurately struck his blade. What happened after that was a carbon copy of what happened before. 6 sword strikes in a row, and 2 gold-ranked swordsmen were easily killed by Brendel in a matter of seconds. In fact, it was not as easy for a normal person to kill a dog. For a moment, the entire left wing of the battlefield was silent. Brando pulled his sword out from the corpse of the second swordsman and wiped it on the latter's clothes before looking around. Wherever he looked, the noble soldiers of the Cross family were so frightened that they retreated like a receding tide. Their fear was contagious, and it quickly turned into a message of despair. Brando moved forward, and thousands of soldiers screamed as if they had seen a ghost. The people at the front could not take it anymore. They threw down their weapons and ran away. At first, only a small portion of the soldiers were in front of Brando, but it destroyed the last of the Cross family's confidence, and the soldiers began to scatter in large numbers. With one person as the center, they began to scatter. On the battlefield, Lord Cross's personal guards and his knights were the ones who held the fort. Brando was still looking at him from afar, but the distance between them was less than 100 meters. However, both sides did not seem to have the intention to continue fighting. Brando stood under the encirclement of the wolves, and he saw the human knight in front of him opening a path for him. Behind him was Lord Cross, who was fully equipped and mounted on his horse. In fact, Lord Cross knew that he had lost, but he did not admit defeat. This knight, who had abandoned his comrades on the battlefield in Cantner, was now sitting on his horse with a long sword in his hand. He ordered everyone to stay, but he wanted to fight Brando alone. He held the long sword in his right hand, sat on the horse's back, and stretched out his left hand towards Brando. Brando looked at him and understood what he meant. This was a challenge. He nodded. Lord Cross raised his long sword and shouted, "Erwin, your sword will always shine." The wolves also separated. Brando rode forward, but his speed was not fast. Lord Cross rushed down the mountain, and Brando slowly ran up the mountain from the foot of the mountain. The two crossed paths. Brando directly transferred the long sword from his right hand to his left hand, and used Bahamut's claw to grab Lord Cross's long sword. Without any fancy moves, he stabbed the long sword with his left hand into Lord Cross's chest. With a bang, the huge force knocked Lord Cross off his horse. This veteran of the November War rolled a few times on the ground, his face covered in dust. Using the last of his strength, he raised his head to look at the young man on the horse's back. "The glory you brought back, cough cough." The muffled voice under the mask said, "I accept it." Brando looked down at the man and said, "Actually, I came to tell you that they did not blame you. That war was not your fault." Lord Cross froze. "How is that possible?" "Cough cough, you are not lying to me. You should know about the oak tree in Dakota's hometown. He asked me to let you take care of it. His father planted it when he was young," Brando replied in a low voice. "It really is him," sob sob sob. The knight cried like a child. "I am sorry," Brando did not say anything. The November War itself was a mistake. He knew that Lord Cross' story came from a quest in the game. Lord Cross was full of remorse for his mistakes. 10 years later, he would issue this quest to all the players he recognized. It was a quest that everyone in the South knew. The quest's name was Atonement. Brando admired the old knight because he was willing to repent for his actions. In fact, he did not make any big mistakes on the battlefield in Canner. He only carried out his orders. Lord Cross wept and died. Brando sighed. The blood of Erwin's people flowed on the battlefield. He had no choice but to end the war. Perhaps only through the baptism of blood and fire could the kingdom be reborn. He raised his head and looked at the remaining Groton knights on the battlefield. "Leave," he said, "this is no longer your battlefield." But the knights shook their heads. "We don't know what you know, sir, but you have brought glory to our Lord. This is a noble act." "Thank you," the leader of the knights replied, "but this is where we will die." The sound of swords being unsheathed could be heard. Brando shook his head and turned around. The black wolves swarmed forward. The Highlanders fled out of fear. Lord Cross died, and Lord Cross's army fell apart. The Grey Bear Lord was hesitant and refused to step forward. Madara did not make a move. But it was fine. Dead people were not to be trusted. The situation on the battlefield seemed to have reversed in the blink of an eye. It was such a solid advantage, but it was gone in a moment. There was a sense of loneliness in the forest. Lord Paulus, who was at the front line, suddenly felt a deep sense of fatigue. He looked around and saw the determination in the eyes of the knights around him. But the corpses of the soldiers on the battlefield were piled on top of each other. Broken spears and broken armors were everywhere. The tattered flags were dyed with the color of the setting sun. In fact, they had already failed. But he could still retreat to Lord Paulus. These rebels could not hold him back. As long as he was still there, he could reorganize the army. Although Madara was indecisive, they were still a force to be reckoned with. But victory was so close, as if it was at hand. It was so close, but why did it disappear in the blink of an eye? Or was it an unrealistic hope? Aween, what's going on? Everything he was familiar with was already far away, leaving behind only the taste of the past memories. The older knights took the younger knights to battle. Before the battle, they told the young Erwin's belief. This belief was passed down from generation to generation. Lord Paulus was once young. He still remembered the songs of the knights. But those ballads were no longer sung. The decaying kingdom was like a dilapidated wall, blocking out all light. The old knight seemed to see the light of new life piercing through the dark wall. He wanted to see the hope behind the wall, but before that, he was destined to be crushed under the collapsing wall. After the news came from both sides of the battlefield, he lost control of the army. Most of the soldiers from the foreign territories fled. The lords and lords retreated to the back of the battlefield. Lord Paulus did not want to mock these cowards because it was meaningless. He led the 3,000 men of Lord Paulus's territory forward. The old knight's mask was stained with the blood of the setting sun. Now, he was going to put an end to this war. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 490. Madara's proud and fearsome army did not dare to cross the line. This was because there were two people standing in front of the undead army, a man and a woman. The woman was an elf, proud and calm like the stars in the sky. She was young and did not seem to be able to show such a calm demeanor, but it did not affect her temperament as a commander. Medisha held a silver shuttle in her hand, holding her spear horizontally, and quietly stopped less than 100 steps away from Tarkus. In her eyes, Madara's army seemed to have disappeared. The man was a middle-aged swordsman. From beginning to end, he did not even look at Madara's army, but the tens of thousands of Madara's undead did not dare to ignore his existence. This was because he was Mephistopheles, the Grey Sword Saint. Lord Paulus has begun the charge. A black knight whispered in Tarkus's ear. Tarkus nodded. What did Lord Enrich say? Lord Paulus said, Erewhon has never lacked heroes. This is the choice of a soldier, and we must respect the glory of the battlefield. The Black Knight replied in a low voice. Tarkus nodded. The vampire commander looked at Medisha, then at Mephistopheles, and replied, Then let's retreat. I hope we can set foot on this land again in our lifetime. We are already dead, Lord Paulus, the Black Knight replied in a low voice. Tarkus thought for a moment and nodded. The figures of the undead disappeared from the forest bit by bit. There were only 2,000 people left on the battlefield. Their enemies were only a few hundred mercenaries, tree elves, and centaurs. But the result was already decided. 2,000 low-level iron soldiers and less than 100 silver-level knights. Their enemies were hundreds of silver-level knights, and even silver-level knights who had survived the calamity of wolves. The Pegasi soared into the sky, and the tree elves' longbows did not miss their targets. It was a one-sided massacre on the battlefield. Lord Paulus felt a sharp pain in his heart when he heard the screams of the young man beside him. These were once Erewhon's future that he believed belonged to. Yes, generation after generation, Erewhon, the older knight, led the younger knights to the battlefield, sang the knight's battle song, and brought them supreme glory. But the older knight found himself powerless. The assault had been stopped long ago. Just on this side of the battlefield alone, Lord Paulus saw at least 4 gold-rank combatants. A red-haired girl with a ponytail who used a spear, a tree elf, a centaur, and an unbelievably beautiful girl with short hair who was dressed in men's clothing. This was the so-called rebel army. At some point in time, the golden flags on the battlefield had been dyed with the color of blood. The old knight watched as the young faces disappeared from his sight. Suddenly, he felt that it was time for this farce to end. Yes, it was time to end this. The spear in Scarlet's hand was no longer the original spear of lightning. The spear of lightning was lost in the dark forest and could not be found. What she was holding now was just an ordinary magic spear. Brando had promised her that he would help her find a suitable weapon after leaving the dark forest, but she did not want to trouble him with this matter. She was afraid that Brando would find her troublesome and despise her like Makarov did. But it was not a good idea to not have a weapon. She was now the strongest person in Brando's camp. Although she was still far from Mephisto's level, Mephisto was not actually one of Brando's men. At most, he was an ally. As for Brando, although he was strong, he was only at the middle of gold rank. Scarlet, on the other hand, was at the peak of gold rank and was only one step away from stepping into the realm of elemental mastery. With her current strength, using an ordinary magic spear was already limiting her combat prowess. However, the girl was a little worried about her personal gains and losses. She gripped her spear tightly and pursed her lips as she slaughtered her way through Count Randner's remaining troops. The remnants of Count Randner's army were only Lord Paulus's own troops. The knight and gold-ranked swordsman reinforcements had already fled long ago. The remaining soldiers were not a threat to her at all. She and Mephistopheles weaved through the enemy's formation in an attempt to completely divide and defeat them. In fact, even Scarlet herself could feel that the enemy was at the end of their rope. At this moment, the spear in her hand trembled as she felt an obstruction in front of her. The girl was slightly startled. She raised her head, and a few people were reflected in her fiery eyes. To be more precise, it was a small group of knight. Lord Paulus's knight regiment. Scarlet's heart trembled. She knew that a silver-ranked knight was the backbone of an army. If she could destroy them first, then this war could end early. Thinking of this, she immediately rushed over there to kill. To her surprise, the other party's reaction was very fast, and he almost immediately noticed her intentions. 4 to 5 knight immediately surrounded her. Reckless. Scarlet furrowed her brows and thought to herself. These knights should be very clear of her strength. She was at the peak of gold rank and could not be compared to these silver-ranked knights. However, these knights did not hesitate when they charged towards her. She could only see determination in their eyes. They were all youths. Scarlet looked at the nervous faces of these youths and suddenly felt sorry for them. For a moment, she thought of her companions who had passed away. Her hands slowed down a little, and the murderous intent in her spear changed direction. Bang! 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 The knight was knocked down from his horse. She continued to move forward, and a knight completely covered in armor appeared in the crowd. Scarlet noticed that the knight was only a silver-ranked, but he was unbelievably experienced. He actually dodged her spear. She did not think too much about it and immediately chased after him with her spear. However, she did not expect the knight to parry her spear with his sword and slash at her at the same time. Scarlet was a little nervous. She subconsciously thought that the enemy was a gold rank who was hiding his strength. She immediately retracted her spear and no longer held back. She feinted with her spear to deceive the enemy's center of gravity. Then, she parried the enemy's sword with her spear and finally pierced the enemy's breastplate. The 3 consecutive spears did not have any room to stop. With a crisp sound, the spear instantly pierced through the enemy's breastplate and pierced through the enemy's body. High-grade magic armor. Scarlet immediately felt that something was wrong when she pierced through the enemy's breastplate. The magic armor he was wearing was not a normal knight's magic armor, but a higher-grade commander's armor. And in this army, there was only one person who could wear such a knight's armor. She was shocked, but she suddenly felt that her surroundings had quietened down. All the knight and soldiers of Count Randner who were fighting seemed to have stopped at this moment. At first, it was only the people around her, but the throbbing quickly spread out like a ripple, and the entire battlefield miraculously came to a standstill. Lord Paulus. A young man who just got up from the ground immediately rushed to the knight who fell under Scarlet's spear. The old knight who was lying in a pool of blood coughed violently. However, his first action was to remove his mask. It was a face that belonged to an old man. His face was full of wrinkles, and his snow-white eyebrows seemed to contain the hardships of this kingdom. His dim, gray eyes seemed to have seen too many storms. He had seen the knights who sang loudly in battle, the older knights who led the younger knights to the battlefield of no return, the glory and triumph that belonged to Erewhon. He had also seen the defeat, the fall, and the final twilight of this kingdom. However, this kind of glory seemed to have fused into a pair of eyes that were flickering with the light of life that was fading away. It was as if everything of the past had returned. Lord Paulus smiled. He first waved his hand weakly at the knight beside him, then raised his head and asked Scarlet, "Little girl, where are you from? I don't believe that you are just ordinary rebels." Scarlet suddenly felt a little helpless. In theory, the old man in front of her was their greatest enemy in this battle, but at this moment, she found that she was unable to reject his question. "I'm from Erewhon," she replied. "Impossible. Peak gold ranked. Peak gold ranked. When did Erewhon have such a young genius? A true genius?" The old man shook his head weakly. "I'm really from Erewhon. I'm a Highlander from Ranner. I used to be a mercenary, and it was Lord Paulus who took me in," Scarlet said seriously. "Such stubbornness, the stubbornness of an Aween citizen. I'm starting to believe that you're an Aween citizen." The old man smiled, but his smile seemed to have used up the last of its splendor. "But why would a genius like you be willing to serve in the rebel army? No, there is no such thing as submission. Lord Paulus is better than me. But even so, he is very good to everyone. Compared to Grodin, I think he is the best lord." Scarlet replied seriously. "Is that so? What is your Lord Paulus called?" Name. "His name is Brando." "Brando. Brando." Lord Paulus closed his eyes and suddenly let out a long sigh. He felt his limbs gradually turning cold, and he lost consciousness. Even his breathing became difficult. But the old man still had one last question. He looked at the battlefield and saw the blood flowing in the forest. It was Erewhon's blood. "What purpose do you have here?" "I don't know, but Lord Paulus said that he is here to save Erewhon." "Save Erewhon?" Lord Paulus's eyes lit up. He looked at Scarlet with a complicated gaze. "How do we save her?" Scarlet shook her head. "I don't know, but I believe that Lord Paulus can do it. Just like how no one believes that you nobles can do it." We nobles. Ha! Cough. The old knight suddenly laughed and shook his head with the last of his strength. "Well said. Listen to my orders, my knights. Surrender." His words were like rolling thunder, and all the young knight were stunned. "Impossible, Lord Paulus. If you die here, we will die here too. This is our honor." "No," the old man weakly closed his eyes. He spoke softly as if he was using the last of his strength. "You must surrender. This is for Erewhon's honor. For Erewhon's unparalleled honor. P.S. I promise you that the explosion is coming, everyone. Please support me with your votes and give me some motivation. I'm rolling on the ground looking for motivation." To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Cheetian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 492. Count Ranner lost. The parchment in Auberway's hand slipped to the ground, and he had to grab it before he could regain his footing. He raised his head and revealed a look of surprise. Princess Griffin listened to the news without batting an eyelid. The outcome of the battle in the south was not announced immediately. Count Ranner's army was routed, and the people around him were speechless for a moment. The losses of the Allied army were not that great. Most of the soldiers fled with the frightened mountain people, and the army of the Grizzly Bear territory was unscathed. The real losses were only a few thousand noble soldiers under Lord Cruss and Lord Paulus. However, the deaths of Lord Paulus, Wade, and Lord Cruss caused the entire southern territory to whisper to each other. Countless nobles of various sizes died in the battle. 2 of them were feudal lords, and one of them was a trusted retainer of Count Ranner. The forces in Tonajol and the northern regions were emptied. Even if Count Randner wanted to, he would not be able to form another army to attack Abes. Unless he personally led an army, but that was impossible. Which feudal lord did not have enemies? Count Randner had to constantly be on guard against his enemies taking advantage of the situation to attack him. Especially at this time, everyone thought that he was a tiger that had lost its fangs, and even his internal organs were beginning to stir. Even though Count Randner hated Brendel to the core, he had to solve his own problems first before he could spare a hand to deal with Brendel. When Count Randner had the time to take action, Brando felt that he would not have to be afraid of him at all. His original goal could be said to be at least half achieved at this moment. At the end of the month of the winter zither, when the flowers bloomed in February and the earth began to thaw, Erwin was discussing the battle everywhere. Only Tonajol was quiet, and the other side that participated in the battle rarely talked about it. Abes had also paid a heavy price in the battle, especially the mercenaries who delayed Count Randner's army. They lost more than half of their men. Some of the veterans who had experienced the November War did not bow down to that tragic war, but they were buried on the banks of the Gree River. Their graves were now in a pine forest, as quiet as a poem. However, the shadow of war was soon washed away by the green wheat sprouts in the fields after the snow and ice melted. After a winter, Wonde regained its vitality and vigor. This made people realize in disbelief that they had won. They won just like that. I didn't even have the chance to enter the battlefield. Carglass sat on a bench with his hands behind his head as he watched Odin and the Aween's royal blacksmith Grandmaster Bosley circling around a pile of scrap metal. At least to him, it was just scrap metal, and it was just a bunch of broken swords. The most direct harvest from this battle was the large number of armors and weapons abandoned by the nobles. These were the things that Abes lacked the most, and Bosley estimated that they would be able to equip an army of 3,000 to 4,000 men. There's still a bunch of junk in my dimension that I collected from the ruins in the Loop of Trade Winds, so I decided to pour them all out. The result was that Bosley's blacksmith shop almost exploded from the sheer amount of junk that he had collected from the ruins in the Loop of Trade Winds. Bosley flew into a rage and chased Carglass and Bosley out of the house. Carglass had taken over Scarlet's position as captain of the White Lion Legion's NCO training and had been following Bosley around all day. But a moment later, the blacksmith ran out again and grabbed Brendel's hand with glowing eyes. "My lord, WHWH, where did you get all these weapons from? You didn't rob an Empire's warehouse, did you?" Brando flung his hand away. "Do you think that the Empire's warehouses are public toilets that you can enter and leave as you please? Even if it's a public toilet, you still have to pay to enter. Isn't that because you're my lord? Everyone says that there's nothing you can't do. Look, everyone is calling you the miracle creator Brando," Bosley said with a smile, "but then again, what's a public toilet?" Brando furrowed his brows. Who gave him such a vulgar title? What, miracle creator Brando? He sounded like the main character in those third-rate night novels. He thought that he would at least have a title like Wolf Herder. Titles were very important to a person's reputation. For example, Wolf Baron Oberway or Crosshand Buga. Most people would know that it was related to the person's personality and ability. If a normal person was called Dead Maggot or Rotten Toe, Brando would rather find a pillar and kill himself. But Carglass's eyes lit up when he heard the vulgar title. He couldn't help but grumble, "Damn it, if I knew that I would come out with my lord, I might have a title too." What title? For example, my lord is called Miracle Creator Brando. Of course, I wouldn't dare to compare myself to my lord, so I'll be called Carglass Follower of Miracle Creator Brando. The young man thought for a while and said seriously. Brando staggered and almost fell to his knees. He immediately looked at the noble descendant of Erwin, the second son of Lord Maxon, with a look of disdain. He couldn't help but worry about the future of the kingdom. What kind of twisted aesthetic is this? For the sake of his future captain and the White Lion Legion, he decided to correct Cargly's aesthetic attitude. It's just a small matter. There will be plenty of opportunities to fight in the future. I just hope that you won't complain when the time comes. Really? Of course, Brando replied, our enemies aren't just our own people, but also Madara. Madara didn't even use their regular army in this war. Do you know why? Madara didn't use their regular army. Bosley didn't experience the first war of the Black Roses in the dungeon, but Carglass had more or less heard about this war. The young man couldn't help but widen his eyes. Madara invaded Erewhon because of the endless internal disputes and unequal distribution of benefits. The new emperor ascended the throne, and the court was in turmoil. In order to divert the internal conflicts, Madara expanded outwards. In fact, the real war was just a legal plunder. The only ones who acted were the nobles. Brando replied seriously, it's just that this expansion is the external manifestation of Madara's internal changes over the past 10 years. The Black Knight of Madara, Enrich, received the support of the Targus family due to his talent and entered Erewhon to seek the capital to rise to the top. Before that, he was just a young man who had just inherited the territory. In this war, there are many young men like him in Madara. Enrich isn't the only one. This was the first time Brando spoke frankly about Madara's threat to his subordinates. In fact, he knew that he wasn't exaggerating. Bosley and Carglass both gasped, how strong is the real Madara? The main forces of Madara's regular army are the Black Knight, the Dark Crusader, the Vampires, and the High Necromancers. The Black Knight and the Dark Crusader are at the bottom of the hierarchy in Madara's regular army. Their strength is at least above the silver rank. Normally, I would call them Tier 3 soldiers. Brando replied, as for the high-ranking forces, there are the Bone Dragons, the Vengeful Banshees, and the Blood Throne Lords. If Erewhon had relied on the Temple Guards, the earliest White Lion Knights, and the Iron Horse Knights created by the late King Eric, they might have had a chance. But now, Brando left some things unsaid. In fact, Madara wasn't the strongest force in the world yet. Whether it was the Cruz Empire, Saint Asol, or the Craftsmen of Byuga, they were all much stronger than this new Dark Empire. At the very least, Byuga's gargoyles and gemstone dragons had once dominated the battlefield. Byuga's sky is the sky of the world. Such domineering words could only be uttered by the artisan mages. It's a pity that the training methods of the Iron Horse Knight have long been lost. Grandmaster Bosley sighed, even the training methods of the White Lion Infantry have been lost many years ago, and the strength of the White Lion Infantry is much weaker than before. Brando nodded. He naturally knew this. The White Lion Infantry was the army that followed the late King Eric to conquer the world. Now that they were reduced to the level of Count Randner's personal guards, it could be said that it was the will of heaven. Erewhon had gone against King Eric's path, and thus received such a punishment. The Temple Guards were the product of the alliance between the Silver Elves and Erewhon. Medisha was one of the products of this alliance, but the alliance was long gone. Erewhon's people even misinterpreted the Holy Covenant and caused Martha's wrath. However, the complicated relationship between Erewhon, the Silver Elves, and the Wind Elves allowed the kingdom to survive until today. It was only after Madara's invasion that the world saw Erewhon's weakness that the kingdom gradually declined. But that was all in the past. Brando patted their shoulders, don't be afraid, we can take it slow. The kingdom is not without hope. The training methods of the White Lion Infantry were lost in the war between the House of Cypher and the House of Corvado, **. It is said that the descendants of the House of Cypher divided the training methods into 3 parts and brought them to the tombs around Monstro. If we have the time, we can go look for it. Year of Summer, New Moon War. Grandmaster Bosley thought that Brando was comforting him, but he did not know that what Brando said was true. The descendants of the House of Cipher divided the training methods into 3 parts and gave them to the 3 princes and princesses. One of the parts was recovered, and the other part was found in the tombs of Monstro. As for the last part, its whereabouts were unknown. The complete set of White Lion infantry was said to be a Class 4 unit, but 2 of them would be Class 3 at the very least. Brando could also think of a way to train the Iron Horse Knight. This was one of the advantages of transmigrating. Now that he had some free time, he had to start preparing for this. However, he first called Bosley back to reality and asked, "Grandmaster, the armor of the Crimson Banner cavalry is quite good. Can you think of a way to improve it?" "Improve it?" Bosley was puzzled. Even though the armor's defense is high, it's not suitable for heavy infantry. Especially since it only strengthens the defense of the arrows. It's a little against the ideals of the White Lion infantry. "No, I want you to help me modify it so that archers can wear it." Brando shook his head. "Archers?" Bosley's eyes widened. He had never heard of anyone being so extravagant that even archers had to wear magic armor. It wasn't that archers weren't precious, but their position was too low. Using magic armor on them was too wasteful. Isn't this too extravagant? Not at all. What if they're the ones wearing it? Brando had Bosley turn around and pointed at a few tall tree elf girls with bows on their backs. They were strolling through the streets of the human world and looking around curiously. Then, Bosley couldn't find the words to object this time. Everyone knew that elven archers were all godly archers. However, he couldn't imagine what an archer wearing magic armor would look like. In theory, an archer's goal was to be agile. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 493. It wasn't difficult for Bosley, who had been working with iron felt for decades, to modify the armor into an archer's armor. Archers had to be flexible in their waist, upper arms, and back, or their accuracy would be affected. Bosley removed a part of the armor and replaced it with flexible plates. The next day, he produced a sample. Quinn put on his armor and stretched his upper body, revealing a satisfied expression. The tree elves were tall and muscular, but Bosley's armor fit them perfectly. It was just that the armor that was supposed to be worn by human cavalrymen was a little too small for the tree elves. It looked a little like the armor worn by the Romans. "It's a little too heavy. There's no way to reduce the weight," Bosley said. No matter how much the armor was modified, the weight of the armor would always fall on the shoulders. However, if the archer's shoulders were too heavy, it would greatly affect their accuracy. Bosley turned to look at his lord, waiting for Brando's response. Brando placed his thumb and middle finger under his chin and looked at the armor with satisfaction. The armor was like a work of art. After Bosley modified the armor's plates, the plates floated up with Quinn's movements and sparkled under the light. "Just give me a weight-reducing prefix. Grandmaster Bosley, can you make a few more samples?" He turned to Bosley and asked. A prefix was a type of enchantment, and there were several types of weight-reducing prefixes. Freya's Wind Dance from the half-plate of the wind armor was the best. Not only would the wearer not feel the weight of the armor, he would even feel as if he was surrounded by a gentle breeze, increasing his agility. "That's not a problem. Why do you need so many samples?" You'll find out soon enough." In fact, Bosley hoped that he would never find out. He watched as Brando took the armor from Quinn's hands and burned it in his hands. The intense magical reaction turned into bright sparks that shot out in all directions. Crackle! 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 The armor melted and formed a huge hole in the armor. It looked like the scene after a candle melted. The metal melted into liquid and sank inwards. The liquid state then solidified again, leaving behind a hole the size of a fist. Brando shrugged. No matter how he looked at it, the armor in his hands was ruined. Alchemy was a job with a high degree of randomness, especially when he wanted to figure out an effective wind elemental magic formation. He could only use the finished product to fill in the gaps. In the next few days, the green flames in the furnace never went out, and the clanging sounds in the smithy never stopped. One set of modified armor after another turned into scrap metal in Brendel's hands. He began to use the cheap wind azurite as the magic core of the wind magic circle. This kind of gem was the most common main material in Vaunt that contained wind elemental magic. It was also the cheapest kind. Although it was called a gem, it was actually cheaper than most magic crystals. Even in the past, when inflation was at its peak, this kind of gem could only be sold for a few thousand tor. However, the results of his experiments were not ideal. The best result he got from the wind azurite was the clumsy prefix. The weight reduction never exceeded 5%, and there were all kinds of negative effects. Brando then tried using celestial stone, green olive, and azure crystal. Each material was more expensive than the last, and the weight reduction increased from 10% to 15%. On the morning of the fifth day, Brando and Bosley, who had dark circles under their eyes, finally came up with the lightweight prefix. Lightweight archer armor, defense +4, arrow resistance +2, weight reduction 20%. However, it was still much heavier than expected. Quinn also said that only the best archers among the tree elves could wear it in battle without any hindrance, but most people could not reach that level. At this time, the rate of archer armor that was modified from the Crimson Banner cavalry's armor had already reached 10%. This result was obviously not what Brando wanted. His goal was to raise the strength of the tree elves' archers to at least rank 3. The strength of a unit was based on a few numbers: attack, defense, mobility, and special abilities. As for increasing attack power, Brando could only do so if he could create a tree elven longbow. That was the standard equipment for the tree elves' archers, but it was a product that was almost 50 years in the future. Moreover, he did not know anything about making bows, so he might as well think of a way to increase his defense. However, it seemed that it was not realistic to equip the tree elves with new armor. At the very least, there was a bottleneck when it came to weight. If this problem was not solved, it would be impossible to equip the tree elves with new armor. The solution was to increase the lightweight prefix to agile. That way, a 30% weight reduction would be enough to meet his requirements. However, the cost of modifying the armor had already exceeded 30,000 tor coins. If it continued to increase, Brando believed that Amandina would come to him to hand in her resignation letter. There's no other way. Grandmaster Bosley was sprawled on his workbench, his hair messy like a bird's nest. This is the limit. If we don't increase the weight, it'll affect our defense. Grandmaster Bosley muttered weakly as he lay on his workbench. Let's equip the elites of the tree elves first. Tamar suggested. He was invited by Brando to participate in the plan. The future master alchemist had been helping Amandina and Seal design the mage tower that they had been planning for a long time. Amandina's magicite laboratory was also part of the plan. Magic was an important resource in Wone's world, and the importance of a wizard tower to a territory was self-evident. Moreover, the wizard tower could gather mana from the public mana pool. Not only could it greatly increase the strength of the spellcasters under him, it could also speed up the development of wizard apprentices. Even the lowest level alchemy laboratory could provide the alchemists working in it with an additional alchemy level bonus. An advanced alchemy laboratory was equivalent to directly providing the Lord with a number of professional alchemists. As long as there was a little bit of money, there was no lord who would not be willing to build a wizard tower in his territory. Moreover, a good mage tower could attract even more mages to become his subordinates and advisors, so why not? Originally, Brando did not want to delay Tamar's progress. But with his black hole of funds, Amandina had no choice but to ask Tamar to help. Otherwise, she was worried that Brando would use the entire territory's wealth to create a super army. In her opinion, her lord seemed to be such a militaristic person, as if he never had a sense of security and always prioritized the development of military power. But Brando still shook his head at Tamar's suggestion. He did not want a small group of elites. In fact, he did not lack such elites. He had the Planeswalker system and the Nest system. If possible, he could form an elite army by himself. What he needed was a main force. A main force like the centaurs, subterranean dwellers, and tree elves. And this main force had to be able to stand firm in the upcoming war. He thought for a moment and replied, "Continue to experiment and see if you can use the same materials to create better enchantments. I'll think of other ways." Brando's method was simple. It was the dragon blood potion. Just like what Quinn said, the tree elves' final product was not completely useless, but it would more or less limit their combat strength. In other words, it was still a matter of weight. But for armor, other than reducing the weight, why not increase the weight of the tree elves? When it came to increasing strength, Brando could not think of anything else other than the dragon blood potion. However, the first batch of dragon blood potion was given to the future officers of the White Lion Legion. The second batch was given to the mercenaries, centaurs, and the tree elf archers to deal with the upcoming battle. There were only a few tree elves, only a few hundred of them. The tree elves in the forest could at least form an army of 1,000. Similarly, Brando did not only want to create rank 3 tree elves, but also the centaurs. This way, he would need thousands of bottles of dragon blood potion. This was not a small number. The blood from the multi-headed dragon would definitely not be enough, and Brando needed to find more materials. There wasn't enough time to acquire them, and Brando didn't want this to drag down his trip to Ampere Seal. He quickly thought of a way, and that was to breed the multi-headed dragon himself. And when it came to breeding the multi-headed dragon himself, it was natural to use a nest. But normal territories did not have enough space to accommodate a nest. For example, ABEs did not have a natural place to gather mana. Brando naturally placed his plans on Valhalla. Speaking of which, ever since he left the Dark Forest, it seemed that it was time for him to rebuild this fortress that had borne countless glories. Brando simply threw the blacksmith's workshop to Bosley and Tamar, and buried himself in the research of the core magic circle of Valhalla. The core magic circle of Valhalla was not complicated, but it required a large number of magic crystals. If this was in the past, Brando would have gone crazy. But at this time, the first batch of people who went to the Black Forest had already returned. Under the protection of the mercenaries, the immigrants built a small mine in the forest. Although the first batch of magic crystals mined was not much, it was enough to satisfy Brando's initial needs. But although Brando was wholeheartedly focused on the magic circle, it was not to the point where he could not extricate himself from the outside world. He knew very well that at this time in history, Princess Griffin should be preparing to go to Ampere Seal to negotiate with Duke Erek. Since the month of spring's dawn in the Year of the Sword, Princess Griffin had already reached a certain degree of agreement with Duke Erek. He was actually a little hesitant about whether he should let the princess and Erek meet first. After all, with Erek in the north in front of them, Tonajul would not be the first to fall into the biggest whirlpool of the battle for the throne. But Brando quickly made up his mind. As the princess's supporter, he would not allow history to repeat itself. Since he had already made up his mind to put on a good show when the princess went to Ampere Seal, the stage this time was naturally the largest trading port in Erewhon. The time had been set, and everything he was doing now was actually to prepare for the upcoming trip. Brando did not put down the work at hand, but sent the Shire and his subordinates out to look for Planeswalker cards. He was very clear that he could not bring an army to Ampere Seal, and even the Black Wolves could not follow. The only things he could rely on were the Planeswalker system and his own strength. But after the battle in the Black Forest, the Planeswalker system was now in a semi-crippled state. In order to revive the system, Brando knew that he first needed a new method of digging up graves. He planned all of this. Starting from the end of the month of the Winter Harp, the upgrading of the army, the rebuilding of Valhalla, and the search for Planeswalker cards were all carried out in an orderly manner. To outsiders, Tonajel seemed unusually quiet, but inside, slow and shocking changes were taking place. This silence lasted until the first week of the month of Spring's dawn, when a piece of news was sent to Brando's desk. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 494. Looking down from the sky, the Tonajel region was high on both ends and low in the middle. There was a basin in the southwest, and Abi's castle was located in that direction. Looking east from Abi's castle, one could see the undulating shadows of the mountains under the azure sky. A large hilly region extended from the western foot of Mount Greyhar, where the tributaries of the Gree River converged. It was the best hunting ground in autumn and winter, and the densest forest was located there. This place was located at the border between Tonajel and Abis. To the north, it was connected to Paulus, and to the east, one could enter the Shaflund mines. It guarded the most important passage out of Tonajel, and it was the best location in Brando's vision for the Tonajel fortress. Although the terrain was uneven, it was never a problem for the dwarves. It was only because of the lack of funds that the plan had only just begun. Some troops were stationed in the hills, and only a few fortresses were erected on the main roads. In the central region of the hills, the forest was divided into an open space. This should have been a place of lush greenery, but now the open space was covered with rocks collected from the forest. On the uneven gray surface was a huge magic formation. Multiple concentric circles formed the main body of the magic formation, and many mysterious runes were written on it. Even the most famous masters in the Royal Society of Erewhon might not be able to recognize these ancient words. To Brando, this magic formation was at least from the era before the Darkness Dragon, and it could be traced back to the Twilight War. A mysterious power flowed in the magic formation, like the whispers of the forest. A pure natural power overflowed in the forest, and green vines grew at a speed visible to the naked eye from the cracks between the rocks. Although the magic formation had only been built for less than a week, the overgrowth of the vines made it seem like it had been sleeping in the forest for hundreds of years. The lush vegetation had been maintained for several days, and the magic formation seemed to be able to gather the magic in the forest. This was the completed Valhalla Central Magic Formation. There was a groove in the center of the magic formation, and it fit perfectly with the city core in Brando's hands. The magic array doesn't require an external source of mana. Once it's completed, it'll be able to extract free mana. Even us silver elves don't have such a powerful law. Metasha looked at the formation in the forest and praised, "What a pure aura of nature, Sir Ruler, you are truly amazing." "It's not my work," Brando replied, embarrassed. Behind Brando, the wild elf elder sister also agreed with the fairy princess. "That's true, but no one can decipher the information about this magic circle on the crystal. Even the druid elders from the dark forest couldn't do anything about it. However, my lord has coincidentally read some ancient books about this. This is definitely a choice of fate." Brendel smiled when he heard Falern's words. He could decipher the crystal more or less because of his special identity. He could understand the real purpose of an item through the extra information projected on his retina, but the natives could only guess the function of a magic item through archaeology or general appraisal. "Then Brando, when should we put the crystal in?" The Roman sat on a rock and asked. "It should be now," Brando replied. He had seen the process of cultivating a city core in the game. A city core was actually a semi-intelligent artificial life. It was planted underground like a tree, and then injected with mana to make it grow. However, before it was planted, it needed a magic circle to reinforce it. This was the first time Brando had seen it. He inserted the crystal in his hand into the groove in the center of the magic circle. He felt the crystal vibrate in his hand, and it seemed to emit a faint light. The light flowed along the runes of the magic circle like golden water. Brando quickly shook his head. At that moment, he almost thought that his eyes were playing tricks on him, because a row of green text appeared on his retina. An unfamiliar request, connecting to the Lord system. Brando's Lord system was actually activated when he first became a Lord. The Lord system was a bit like the town panel in SLG. It could be used to monitor the operations of his territory. For example, Brando's Lord system currently had two submenus, the Loop of Trade Winds and Tonajal, 2/3 territories. He could see the income and expenditure of the two territories, their specialties, population, mines, forests, and security, etc. At the same time, there was also a set of personnel appointment data. For example, he could see who was in charge in different submenus. For example, the person in charge of Tonajal's finances was Roman. If Brando transferred Roman from this position, he could see a series of effects on the territory's finances in the future. This system already existed in the game, but it was more powerful in the game. Players could even use this system to make personnel appointments and issue government orders. However, in the world of Wond, the Lord system could not be used in real life. It was basically a surveillance system. Just the surveillance alone was already very powerful. Brando could see that if Roman was the person in charge of the Shaflund silver mine, then the income of the silver mine would increase by almost 1/3 in the next 3 months. It was only when he discovered the secret of the Lord system that he had a direct understanding of this merchant lady's ability. But even so, he would rather let Roman remain in charge of Tonajal's finances. Although the little Roman's talent in financial management was far inferior to her talent in business, the trade in the territory was not only the income of the silver mine. Based on the total amount, it was better for her to stay in this position than to be the person in charge of the mine. Of course, these were all digressions. Brando looked at the line of green words floating in his vision. He was slightly stunned for a moment before he agreed to the request. Then, a new subsystem appeared under the Lord system. Its name was Valhalla. However, this system was still grayed out. Brando tried to touch it, but he immediately received a notification. Valhalla is being cultivated. The first stage requires 132,000 mana, 132,000 units of mana. Brando was shocked. The unit of mana here was mana. Of course, 130,000 mana was not something that anyone could provide. Even the leaders of the wizards like William and Tolman would be sucked dry if they came here. This amount of mana could only be provided by magic crystals. Brando immediately understood. The lowest grade of magic crystals was the Lesser Moonstone, followed by the flame-patterned agate. But he was not a wizard before, nor was he a professional alchemist. He did not know how many units of mana could be converted from a Lesser Moonstone. He was a little nervous. If the conversion rate was too low, then this thing called Valhalla would be a bottomless black hole. Thinking of this, Brando quickly took out the prepared magic crystal from the Dimension Cave. It was a Lesser Moonstone. The quality of the magic crystal veins in the dark forest was not bad. At least, the mana on this Lesser Moonstone was much richer than what Brando had seen in the market. He threw the Lesser Moonstone into the magic circle. Almost in the blink of an eye, the rhombus-shaped magic crystal lost its color and became transparent like glass. The notification in Brando's vision also changed. Valhalla is being cultivated. The first stage requires 131,900 mana. 1:100. Brando sighed in relief. If the lowest grade moonstone could be exchanged for 100 units of mana, then the highest grade of magic crystal would not be a problem. He then tried the flame-patterned agate. Sure enough, the exchange rate of a flame-patterned agate was about 2,000. In this way, 130,000 units of mana would only require a few hundred magic crystals. The magic crystals mined in the dark forest were in tons for the first time. In fact, the magic crystals in the territory were only needed by the mages in the Shire, Lubai, and Master Tamar. Therefore, Brando put almost half of the magic crystals into his own pocket. He was not worried that Valhalla would not need enough magic crystals. But he soon realized that he was too naive. Hundreds of crystals were thrown down in exchange for a pile of transparent and colorless glass. At this time, the city core had finally absorbed enough mana for the first stage. The entire crystal let out a creaking sound, and a large number of cracks immediately appeared on it. Then, with a cracking sound, the city core shattered in front of everyone's eyes, and a tree grew out from the original groove. A small tree sprout. What the hell is this? Even with Brando's knowledge, he could not help but be dumbfounded. It was ridiculous enough to plant the city core like a tree, and he did not expect a sapling to grow out of it. But Brando also knew that this sapling was not ordinary. No one would believe that a few hundred magic crystals would produce an ordinary sapling. The sapling grew with the wind, and in an instant, it grew to about the same height as Brando. Brando looked up and saw that the sapling had begun to grow thicker and longer. It stretched out its branches like the ancient elves' sacred tree. In just a moment, it had grown to a height of several meters, and it needed a person to wrap their arms around it. In just a short minute, this sapling had grown to a height that ordinary trees would need at least 10 years to achieve. But it did not seem to have any intention of stopping. Everyone present saw dense aerial roots growing on the tree trunk, and many roots also sprouted from the surface of the stone formation. These roots were also growing at a speed visible to the naked eye, and then twisted together. In a few breaths, the sapling had grown bigger. They could only watch helplessly as an ancient tree grew. This is... At this time, Orthlis, who had been sleeping in Brando's mind, was awakened by the drastic changes in the surrounding magic. She was speechless when she saw the tree. Brando was speechless for a long time. Because right in front of him, the sapling was getting thicker and thicker. Countless roots and branches extended from the trunk, and it had grown to a height that 7 or 8 people could wrap their arms around it. However, the height of the tree was not very high. It was only a few meters above the ground. At this time, Brando gradually saw the shape of the tree. It formed a natural square between the canopies. Holy shit! Brando finally reacted. Isn't this the world tree in the loop of trade winds? P.S. Put the Wind Archer, Part 2, at the end. If you see it, don't ask where Part 2 went. Anyway, the chapters are in the right order. Yes, the development of this territory will be written together. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 495. The world tree stopped growing when it reached a radius of about 10 meters. The huge canopy stretched out in all directions and then stopped, as if it had been there for hundreds of years. The emerald green leaves covered the canopy layer by layer, forming a quiet whole with the surrounding forest. Rays of sunlight shone down from the branches and leaves like golden swords. Brendel looked up and saw the green veins on every leaf, as if a layer of jade-green blood vessels were distributed all over the tree crown. An ancient tree quietly sat in the center of the ancient and mysterious magic circle. The Roman was stunned, and Romaine's mouth was wide open in shock, as if she was letting out a short "aw." Scarlet's amber eyes widened behind her, but ever since she followed Brando, most of the things she encountered were strange, and this strong-willed ponytailed girl had more or less developed some self-control, so her eyes were only filled with disbelief. Metisha, who used to be the youngest silver elf princess, was slightly better. At least she still maintained the dignity of a silver elf, but her eyes flashed. Only the wild elf elder sister, Falerne, still had a poker face. This was not because of her personality, but because she was a part of the rules of a planeswalker. Unlike Medisha, who later became a knight, she had a lot more experience. After experiencing something even more unbelievable, even if a real-world tree were to grow in front of his eyes, it would not seem so surprising anymore. Brando, you just planted a seed. The first to speak was the Roman girl. Romaine's face was filled with curiosity and excitement. She probably thought that Brando had done something amazing again. How did a tree grow out of nowhere? It's growing so fast. Am I dreaming? Brando, pinch me. Brando glared at her and came back to his senses. Romaine's way of thinking could never be understood by a normal person. Just like when they first met Madara's undead in Butchie, she expressed her fear by saying, "Brando, will they eat us?" She also expressed her curiosity by saying, "Ah, that's amazing, Brando. This is the world tree, right?" Medisha turned around and asked. The fairy princess's silver eyes flashed with some kind of rationality, but she did not directly come to a conclusion, "My lord." "No, rather than saying that it's..." Brendel shook his head as he looked at the tree that could be considered huge. Instead of calling the tree the world tree, it would be more appropriate to call it a town under the cover of a huge tree. In some ways, it was like the world tree in Valhalla. The same huge canopy, intertwined roots, and looked like a miniature version of the world tree. But this tree stretched out in all directions at the top, and even at the foot of the tree, one could see that it formed a huge platform. Rather than a platform, it was more like a square under the shade of the tree. The brown trunks formed a towering wall, protecting the square above the wall. There were even some slender branches that grew from the edge of the square, weaving together to form railings or handrails. But from a standard military point of view, this was a parapet or parapet. In short, the tree had grown into a small natural fortress. "This looks like a castle, so beautiful." Scarlet looked at the tree, or rather the small castle, in a daze. It was just like the castle in the forest described in fairy tales where the sleeping princess lived. It had a dreamlike verdant color. Even though the red-haired girl had long since tied her long hair behind her head like a true daughter of the mountain people and picked up a spear to throw herself into battle, she would still occasionally reminisce about the days when she longed for the fairy tales of the past. After all, compared to that, she would rather be a normal girl with the right to dream. Of course, if the Lord was willing to give her such a castle. Scarlet couldn't help but stare blankly for a moment. The Roman had already begun circling the tree, and it was obvious that she wanted to go up. After a while, the cute girl found a treasure. "There's a ladder here, Brando." There was indeed a ladder behind the ancient tree, like a spiral staircase to welcome guests, or rather, to welcome the master. The spiral staircase hung from the top of the tree. It grew naturally from the vines attached to the trunk, but it didn't look thick at all. Instead, it looked like it had been artificially woven, exquisite and beautiful. The width between each step was just right. The moment you saw this ladder, you would know that it wouldn't take much effort to climb it up. Moreover, it had a kind of intimate atmosphere, and no one would suspect that it was a trap. "Are we going up?" The merchant girl looked up, her beautiful bangs sliding to the sides, revealing her flat forehead. She blinked and asked Brando. Brando looked at the others. In the past, he had developed a habit in the game, which made him habitually ask for the opinions of the players in the same party, even though there was probably no other player here except for him. The quiet silver elf princess, the wild elf sister who would not disobey his orders even though she was very annoying. She was the secretary, or rather the head maid who was always by his side, and these were the roles that his subordinates recognized. There was also the little Roman and the mercenary girl who followed his orders. These girls were actually led by him. Brando quickly realized that he had made a habitual mistake. He couldn't help but shake his head with a smile. After all, habits in the game couldn't be changed in such a short time. The fairy princess saw the embarrassment of the lord and smiled faintly. We elves are very sensitive to the atmosphere of nature. This tree gives me a feeling of intimacy. But it's not a spontaneous feeling of intimacy. It's more like a feeling of home, as if it's inviting us up. Yes, actually I have the same feeling. Brando nodded, but his words were not entirely correct. For him, the relationship between the tree and him was more like a subordinate relationship. Because the city core that was planted was bound to him, he had a vague feeling that he could control everything in front of him. He even felt that he could command the spiral ladder. This feeling was so strong that Brando couldn't help but give an order in his mind. Shrink back. He ordered, and a soft rustling sound was heard. A miracle happened. The naturally hanging vine ladder actually retracted. It was as if the vines had suddenly come alive. They retracted and turned back into ordinary plants that clung to the tree trunk. Ah! The Roman was shocked and quickly hid behind Brando. You can command it? Medisha asked in surprise. Brando nodded. He was also very curious, but this curiosity had a certain guess. If this guess was true, then all of this would be a little too unbelievable. Let's go up and take a look. He immediately said. At this time, the curiosity of the others was more or less aroused. Even the expressionless Falerne couldn't help but carefully observe the vine ladder that was once again hanging down. The ladder was actually very sturdy. As expected, the group climbed up the spiral ladder without much effort. It was as if the ancient tree was holding them up. Soon, everyone reached the top of the trunk. What appeared in front of them was a small circular square. Under the lush shade of the tree, the square was about 100 steps from one end to the other. It was wider than expected. Surprisingly, the ground of the square was covered with a layer of stone instead of wood. A small fountain stood in the middle of the square, and the bottom of the fountain was full of shining pebbles. On one side of the square, there was a large hall. The architectural style of the building was similar to that of the elves' houses. The pure wooden structure was built with arched beams and a tall roof that was full of fantasy. Everyone was stunned. This is the city hall. Medisha recognized this building. For the first time, her eyes showed disbelief. Could it be that this tree is actually a magic town? I'm afraid you guessed right. Brando felt as if he had been hit by a huge surprise. Because of this, he was only suspicious at first, but when he saw this hall, he was sure without a doubt. Valhalla was a tree, a living city. A city could grow naturally and didn't need to be expanded. Its branches and leaves could shelter the entire territory from the wind and rain, and the city was a whole, so it was much easier to defend. Too cool. This was definitely the territory that Brando dreamed of. Although Valhalla was still very small, and the distance from one end to the other was only 30 meters, but even so, it already had the embryonic form of a magic town. In the city hall, Brando saw the full map of Valhalla. The map was presented on a wooden platform in the middle of the hall. Or rather, it was a natural tree stump. A crystal grew out of the tree stump, and the entire structure of Valhalla was projected in this crystal. It was hollow, and there were stairs from the four sides of the square that led down to the hollow branches of the ancient tree. The bottom was divided into many large and small rooms, which seemed to be the residential area and the natural warehouse of the town's residents. Brando found that this area could be transformed into a military camp, or perhaps it was the original intention of its existence. There was also a passageway in the town hall that led downwards. This passageway was connected to the 3 rooms at the bottom of the tree trunk. These 3 rooms had natural mana pools. These mana pools were connected to the ground by the massive roots of the ancient tree, so they could produce an endless supply of mana. These rooms were called the Magic Nest, and this was where the nest was located. At the same time, it could also be transformed into a crystal pool, or an alchemy laboratory, wizard tower. There are actually 3 mana pools. Medisha looked at the holographic map and was shocked. Such a small magic town, no matter how you look at it, it can only be considered a beginner territory. Beginner territory? What's that? The other girls looked at the fairy princess in confusion. P.S. A few days ago, the network in this area was under maintenance, so there were no updates. The nearby internet cafes also can't be accessed, so there was no notification on QQ. It seems like it's missing 3 to 4 chapters, and with the benefits, it's a total of 5 chapters. Of course, it's not realistic to finish it in one day, so let's just update it for a few days. Also, I apologize for the lack of updates a few days ago. It was really unavoidable. Meow, I was leading the team that day and I dropped it. It was too embarrassing. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 496. I'm sorry for my rudeness. The silver elf took a deep breath to calm herself down and explained, before the War of the Holy Saints, a concept used to differentiate the strength of a territory. Half of what we call a primary territory refers to a primitive area like Tonajul that has yet to be developed by magic. The girl gently pressed her hand on her chest. In such an area, the scattered mana is in a state of chaos. Only within a certain range, the mana will naturally converge into a mana convergence point, which is the mana pool, or the magic nest. She glanced at the others, mainly Roman and Scarlet. Actually, all of you have seen such a place before. A place where mana converges will be affected by chaos and become a monster's nest. So that's how a monster's nest is formed. Roman tapped his lips with his index finger and asked curiously, but how is a monster's nest related to the strength of a territory? Don't tell me that the more nests there are, the better. Isn't that strange? Medisha shook her head and couldn't help but laugh. Of course not, but in the civilized world, the human and elven armies will often seize such places and build monsters' nests to serve their civilization, or build wizards' towers and crystal ponds. Wizards' towers, crystal ponds, and monsters' nests can greatly enhance a lord's strength. Therefore, the more mana pools a territory has, the more mature and powerful the territory will be. Only a territory with at least 10 mana pools is qualified to be called a magic territory. The concept of a magic territory is far beyond the human's definition of a lord. In the entire multiverse, the lord of a magic territory is respected. Medisha said with a smile, a noble like Groudon is still within the scope of your human concept. But if he leaves your society, or even if he leaves Erewhon, he is worthless. But even if he only has 1 mana pool, it means that he is at least famous in the world. She looked at Brando. Even though this young lord's name was not well known in Erewhon, but in the world that worshipped power, his status far exceeded Groudon's. In that case, how big is the area where there is a natural mana gathering point? Romaine asked again. She was always curious about such strange knowledge. About. Medisha thought for a moment. According to Erewhon's system, such an area is about the size of a baron's territory. Scarlet listened intently. She had never come into contact with such advanced knowledge before. In the borders of the kingdoms like Randner and Grimoires, not to mention mercenaries, even nobles might not have heard of such things. She could not help but blurt out, does that mean there's such a place in Ferber as well? Ah, so that's how it is. The Roman's eyes suddenly flashed with understanding. Romaine's reaction to such trivial matters was usually astounding. The Shire has been acting mysteriously recently. I heard from the mercenaries that he often appeared around Schaflund, saying that he wanted to build some sort of tower. So he was looking for a mana convergence point, right? That little brain of yours is pretty quick. Brando finally could not hold back his annoyance and interjected. I've always been very smart. Brando, you're too stupid to only realize it now. Ouch. Romaine immediately hugged her head. Before Medicia's tail could fully curl up, Brando knocked her head. He did not know why this little girl who claimed to be a lady and elegant merchant would always use her only intelligence on such messy matters. Indeed. Tamar and Amandina calculated that there should be a mana convergence point near Schaflund. Brando replied. I didn't expect Miss Amandina to have the talent of an astrologer. Medicia praised sincerely. Brando also did not expect it, but Amandina had already calculated it before they entered the dark forest. At that time, they did not even have enough magic crystals to forge the white lion armor, let alone build a wizard tower. But is a wizard tower like those spiky towers in the stories? What's the use of it? Is it the home of a wizard? Brando, is it where the Shire lives? The Roman held her head and asked evasively. Most people would not be able to answer this question. Even Medicia might not understand the mysterious things between wizards, but there was a wild elf sister, Falerne, who was an elementalist. Falerne bowed slightly and spoke in a methodical manner as if she was reciting a book. A wizard tower is not only a wizard's home, Miss Roman. At the top of the wizard tower, there is a huge resonant crystal. This crystal is carved out of magic crystal and can increase the power and distance of most area of effect spells. It can even extend the range to thousands of meters, or even tens of thousands of meters. Wizards can use this crystal to form an indestructible fortification of the wizard tower, attacking the enemy from outside the line of sight. In addition, the crystal ball in the tower can also be used to monitor the territory. A wizard tower of the lowest level is enough to monitor the entire area around Abyss. It is one of the most important defensive structures in the territory. At the same time, there is also an alchemy laboratory and a public mana pool. A public mana pool. Training an apprentice wizard requires a lot of spellcasting practice. When a wizard is at a lower level, they often need to rest for a long time to recover their spirit after casting a few spells. A public mana pool can greatly reduce the time needed to rest. In other words, it shortens the time needed to train an apprentice wizard, Miss Roman. You don't have to call me that, Miss Falerne. It sounds scary. Roman patted her chest and said with some lingering fear, anyway, I understand. A wizard tower is a very important place, right? Falerne nodded seriously. Brando also nodded. Falerne was right. In the game, it would only take 3 weeks to train a farmer into a soldier, but it would take almost a year to train an apprentice wizard. With the Sorcerer Tower, this time could be shortened by 10 times. Every month, the Sorcerer Tower could train a qualified sorcerer apprentice. After an apprentice wizard leveled up, they could become a grade 1 elementalist or wizard. At the same time, they could cast up to 3 Circle 1 spells. Among the Circle 1 spells, Magic Arrow and Magic Shield were the most practical spells. When cast in a group, they could still be very powerful. Moreover, apprentice wizards were the foundation of many types of troops. For example, anti-magic swordsmen and shadow cavalry needed to be trained as an apprentice wizard. The construction of a wizard tower required a mana pool, so a mana pool was very important to a high-level territory. Not only a wizard tower, but there were also artificial mana pools that could be converted into mana crystals, as well as lairs that could cultivate fantasy creatures. When a territory was enchanted to a certain extent, it could be built into a high-level camp. For example, the Pegasus Night Camp of the Tree Elves required a Pegasus lair and a moon gate. The Silver Elf girl continued, that's why, generally speaking, half of nature's primary territories would only have 1 natural mana pool like this, and Valhalla actually has 3 in her right hand. This is too inconceivable, it's like the legendary magic plains. Magic plains. Brando turned to look at Medisha. He had heard of this term before. A magic territory in a civilized world can only be called a magic territory if it has at least 10 mana pools. However, there are some natural wastelands that have such power. Although there may not be 10 mana pools, we still recognize such a land as a natural magic territory. Medisha continued, the magic plains is one of them. I've heard of the magic plains as well. The magic plains are also known as the four-leaf clover field. This kind of land has a high concentration of mana, and the growth of magical plants in the four-leaf clover field is several times faster than normal guarded lands. Brando said. Martha's guarded lands are actually a type of magic ground, but it's a special kind. The Black Forest is also one, and there's also the Fire Plains and the Holy Land of War. However, I've only heard of them. She raised her head and said, but the world tree that my liege has planted has more magic power than any land with natural magic that I have ever seen. 3 mana pools, even the Silver Valley where we Silver Elves used to live doesn't have such powerful natural magic power. The legendary fortresses are said to be holy lands. They are the last bastions that our ancestors used to defend against the Twilight Dragon. They have the same power as the Holy Lands. The Silver Valley is also such a fortress. She continued, but they are far less powerful than the remaining power of Valhalla. I don't know why this fortress is so special, but it must have its reason for existence. If I have to give a name to the magic ground where Valhalla is located, I'll call it the Holy Land. Medisha said. Holy Land. That's a good name. The Roman agreed. Scarlet also nodded. She felt that the Lord's things should be worthy of such a name. Of course, if Brando knew of her thoughts, he would probably blush. The Silver Fairy Princess looked at the young man who was her master. Halran Gaia, the Golden Apple, Valhalla, legendary things appeared one after another around him. If it was before, she would have thought that it was a coincidence. But suddenly, Medisha wondered if this was a call from fate. Just like how fate had called her back then. For some reason, she suddenly looked forward to the future. However, no matter what, the fact that Valhalla had 3 mana pools was like a pie in the sky. Normal players would often face a difficult choice when building a territory. There were 3 essential magic buildings for a beginner territory, the Wizard Tower, the Crystal Pool, and the Magic Workshop. However, Brando didn't have this concern. Tonajal already had a mana gathering point that could generate a mana pool. He could arrange the rest himself. Originally, he wanted to leave Valhalla's mana pool for the Hydra's nest, but now it seemed that there was still a surplus. But then Brando made a new discovery. He originally planned to transform the mana pool at the bottom into a Hydra's nest, but he then found that the mana pool at the bottom was not empty. Instead, it generated a building called the Vortex of Light. After looking at the detailed information on the holographic map, he found that this thing turned out to be a creature's nest. This nest could generate a creature called a light spirit. This thing sounded like a heroic spirit, but also like a light elemental creature. It was definitely a pleasant surprise that there was a natural nest in his territory. Nests were not common goods in the entire history of the Amber Sword. Of course, nests like black wolves and wyverns were exceptions. However, Brando believed that Valhalla's nest would definitely not be of such quality. Moreover, most of the creatures in Valhalla's nest were very powerful. He was eager to know what this light spirit was. He suggested that they go down to take a look, and the ladies naturally did not object. Only Falerne stayed behind. Her reason was that Brando was cultivating the core of Valhalla here, and the messengers outside could bring news of Abes at any time. When the mercenaries saw a tree appear out of thin air, they would probably be scared half to death. She stayed outside to avoid unnecessary trouble. Brando could only praise this wild elf sister for her meticulousness. Out of all his subordinates, only Fullerene and Amandina could be so meticulous and meticulous. However, Amandina had been busy with the affairs of the territory recently, and only this wild elf sister with a poker face could help him deal with these trivial matters. Even though she always looked unwilling, the standard of her work was always top-notch. The rest of the people found the entrance to the hollow area below Valhalla at the back of the hall, and entered the room where the light vortex was. The lower area of Valhalla was actually like a huge tree hole. The floor and walls were made of pure wood. Even though it was smooth as if it had been polished by humans, the ceiling and walls had roots and vines that hung down, giving it a natural atmosphere. In the middle of a large crystal cluster that emitted a blue light, 2 large vines intertwined to form an arch. In the center of the arch, there was a golden vortex that was about 3 meters tall that was slowly stirring. The eye of the vortex seemed to be a passage that connected 2 worlds, and a ray of golden light shot out from it like a bridge that hung in the air. There were some plants growing in the corner of the room, and under the illumination of various lights, these strange plants reflected a myriad of colors that made it seem like an illusion. "It's so beautiful, Brando." The Roman couldn't help but praise as soon as he entered the lair. "This looks like a portal. This lair should be a passageway, right?" Medisha asked. Brando nodded. "To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 497. This was a portal-type lair, and it seemed to be connected to a secondary plane. This type of lair mostly produced creatures through summoning, using equivalent exchange to summon creatures to serve the summoner. Brando looked at the portal of light, and took out 2 secondary moon crystals from the dimension hole and threw them in. Sure enough, the time vortex lit up, and a small head poked out from it. It was like a 3-inch tall little person, or rather, a scaled-down young girl. She had long curly hair and was covered in clothes as thin as a cicada's wings. Her entire body glowed, and although she had no wings, she could agilely hover in the air. She looked outside from the vortex, then flew to Brando and the others and said respectfully, "Hello, my lord." Her voice was thin, and her accent was a little strange, as if she was a foreigner speaking Cruz. As the girl spoke, she looked at everyone curiously, but she was not afraid. "The lord she's talking about is the master of a magic territory, similar to your human lord, but different. In the eyes of magic creatures, only those who have power are natural lords, and they don't agree with titles." Medisha explained to Scarlet and Roman. "Oh." Roman nodded, but it was not clear if he understood. Brando nodded. Unlike Scarlet and the others, he was no stranger to magic creatures because of his experience in the game, so he asked directly, "What's your name, what kind of creature are you, and what abilities do you have?" "My name is Monica." The girl put her hand on her chest and introduced herself. "We are light spirits, the people of light entrusted to protect this sacred land. Our ability is to nurture this World Tree Fortress." World Tree Fortress. Brando frowned. For some reason, he was very familiar with this name, as if he had heard it somewhere before. But thinking about it carefully, he did not know if this memory came from the game or the myths and legends of this world. The World Tree Fortress, or in your words, Lord, you can call it Valhalla. However, Valhalla is actually the name of the second World Tree Fortress. This is the third and last one. Monica replied. What second and third? What exactly is a World Tree Fortress? Brando could not help but ask. I don't know about that, my lord. Our knowledge comes from the inheritance of magic. That's what my memories say. This tree is the most basic form of the World Tree Fortress. That's all I know. Brando nodded again. What Monica said was not strange. Many of the knowledge passed down in the bloodline were just words and phrases. However, this was only a casual question. He was more concerned about Valhalla's growth potential. Your ability is to nurture this tree. How do you do that? The world tree grows slowly once it sprouts. Think of us as gardeners pruning the branches of the tree, my lord, Monique replied. Brando understood. So, you are the workers of this town, right? Monica nodded. You can put it that way. We can help you build this city according to your wishes, Sir Overlord. Then what can you build now? I can't do it alone, my lord. The light spirits are not omnipotent. I need more of my people to work with me. If there is 1, 2, or 3 light spirits, I can help my lord build the tree nest. Tree nest. Brando did not understand. He was very familiar with the order of construction in the kingdom of Erewhon, such as the nobles' barracks and blacksmiths. He had also seen some high-end buildings, but he had never heard of such a term. What is that? The tree nest can cultivate the ancient tree roots. They are the most basic defense of the world tree. Their strength is about the pinnacle of silver tier, but they cannot leave the world tree. My lord, you can see them as mobile fortifications, or the guards of this town. In addition, the ants and the world tree are actually one. They are a part of the world tree, so they do not need the mana pool to provide them with power. The tree nest can be built in this square or on the top of the tree crown. It does not need the mana pool, Monica added. A part of the world tree. Brando felt that this sounded like the rotten beasts of the golden demonic tree, but he was still very interested in the tree nest that did not need the mana pool. Although they could not leave the world tree, they could be used for defense. After all, they were guards at the peak of silver. How many of these guards can the tree house create? With the current space of the world tree, it can at most accommodate 1, 2, 3, 4 tree nests, and each tree nest can produce 1, 2, 3, 10 roots, my lord. Monica calculated seriously. 40, that was not enough. He was a little disappointed. If there were 100 of them, he could rely on Valhalla without any worries. But when he thought about it, Valhalla was only the size of a palm, and the city hall was already a little cramped. Even if there were 100 or 1,000 guards, there would not be enough space to fit them. Thinking of this, he asked again, Valhalla. I mean, this world tree, how can it continue to grow? Monica replied, that's the mission of the light spirits. Our mission is to nurture the growth of the world tree. However, if it's just Monica alone, it will take 1, 2, 3. Wait, don't count, just tell me how many years it will take. When Brando heard Monica counting to 40 with her fingers, he finally could not help but sweat. He was afraid that this little girl would keep counting until the sky turned dark. How do you know how many years it will take if you don't count? Monica stared at Brando with her eyes wide open, seriously wondering if her lord was an idiot to ask such a stupid question. Brando immediately knelt down. The two of them haggled for a long time, and finally understood that if she were to cultivate the world tree alone, it would take 200 years. 200 years. Scarlet was shocked when she heard this number. As a standard mortal, 200 years was a little hard for her to accept. That was almost the time of a mortal's life. That is to say, as long as you have 200 people, Monica, you can shorten the time to 1 year, right? Brando had his own set of calculations. After all, 400 moon crystals was not an unacceptable price for him. Let me calculate. Don't calculate yet, just tell me yes or no. Brando was sweating profusely again. In the previous discussion, he had discovered that the light spirits did not only count to 10, but they seemed to like to do things by the book and did not like to save steps. All right then, but if we have to complete it within a year, we won't be able to spare time to help Lord Brendel build other buildings. Monica thought for a moment and answered. However, this was not a problem for Brando. He could pay more light spirits to help him build his territory. But just as this idea formed, Monica saw through it and immediately shattered Brando's fantasy. "My lord, there is a limit to the number of light spirits that can pass through the portal. Are you thinking of summoning thousands of light spirits to help Monica?" "Limit?" Brando's daydream was shattered like a mirror falling to the ground. He never thought that there was such a setting. "What is the limit?" "The light vortex can only withstand 1, 2, 3, 20 energy transitions per month." "That's 20. Monica nodded. 20 a month. Just summoning 200 light spirits would take 10 months, which meant that it would take at least a year and a half for the world tree to grow to the next stage. Brando suddenly felt a little disillusioned. He did not have that much time. He thought that Valhalla Fortress would become his main force in a short period of time. But fortunately, Monica's next words gave him a glimmer of hope. She said that the portal could be expanded, but the prerequisite was to build a moon tower in Valhalla. Brando knew about the moon tower. It was a type of auxiliary building to the mage tower, and its function was to train astrologers. In the game, astrologers were actually a type of wizard. Their ability was prophecy, and at the same time, they were proficient in channeling mana. Astrologers could change the location of mana gathering points, or use the moon tower to channel mana from the mana pool into the lair, increasing the production of creatures in the lair, or increasing the efficiency of the alchemy laboratory. This was their function in the game, and Monica wanted to use the first function of the moon tower. Even though he did not know if the stats in the game would work here, but since a native like Monica said that it would work, and Medisa did not object, then there should be no problem. A moon tower could strengthen 3 other buildings. Although the moon tower itself required a location for a mana pool, its effect was equivalent to dividing the mana pool into 3. In the past, it was not a rare building in the game. However, Brando felt that he would be the first to build a moon tower in a beginner's territory. Normally, Lord-class players would either build a wizard tower or a crystal pool. Very few would even build lairs, let alone a moon tower. Although Brando had never been a Lord-class player, he felt that it was too strange. However, with the moon tower, the production of the light vortex could be increased to 40. Brando was very optimistic about the growth of Valhalla. After all, the title of the most legendary territory in the Amber Sword was not given by him. He saw Valhalla as his biggest potential support in the future. As long as this fortress could be revived faster, it did not matter how much he invested. And so, Brando used the remaining secondary moon crystals to summon the remaining 19 light spirits. He did not know what kind of bad taste the designer had, but the light spirit race did not seem to have any males. All the light spirits that were summoned were all small and soft girls. They were like real fairies, chattering non-stop. In a short while, the Hall of Yggdrasil was as lively as Erewhon's most prosperous market. Brando and the others could not help but feel a headache when they saw the noisy light orbs flying all over the sky. He could imagine how lively the city of trees would be when there were thousands or even tens of thousands of such residents in the future. In fact, he doubted that the other residents of the city would be able to sleep at night. At the same time, he also asked Monica about the other abilities of the light spirits. He learned that it would take about a week for the 20 sisters to build a moon tower. This was not considered slow. The construction of a moon tower required the magical power of a wizard. If Brando only relied on the help of the Shire, his apprentices, and half-baked warlocks, it would take at least 2 to 3 months. This was also the estimated construction time of his wizard tower. At the same time, apart from the tree burrow, the light spirits would also build 2 special buildings that belonged to Valhalla. The Valyrian Warrior Hall and the Wind Archers Camp. Brando had never heard of these 2 buildings before, but according to Monica, these 2 buildings were the core of Valhalla's ability to preserve Valhalla's heroic spirits. Thus, Brando guessed that these 2 buildings would be used to train these 2 special units. Since Monica said that these 2 buildings did not require a mana pool, he would definitely put them on the agenda. After all, this was the main reason why he needed Valhalla. The Valyrian warrior hall would take 10 light spirits a month to build, and the Wind Archers camp would take less time, but it would still take 3 weeks. Brando planned to build the warrior hall in the plaza, directly opposite the city hall, while the Wind Archers would be able to use the second floor of Valhalla. The tree burrow would be built on top of the canopy, and it would take up all the space available in Valhalla. Just as he finished his calculations, he raised his head and saw Falerne walking in with a few people. Behind her was Lord Maxon's second son, Carglass, who was the captain of Maxon's personal guard, and 2 other tall tree elf girls with long bows on their backs. Carglass walked around the Hall of the World Tree, looking around curiously like a monkey. He did not look like a noble at all. However, the 2 elven girls weren't much different. They looked at the tree hall with astonishment. The tree elves had never seen such an architectural style outside of the Green Tower, which was similar to their hometown. However, when Brando saw Carglass and the tree elves together, the first thing that came to his mind was whether Bosley and Tamar had made any progress. Author's note: didn't we agree on 2 chapters, but each chapter is 4,000 words. Oh my God. Why don't we release 2 chapters this month? Or maybe we can vote on it. The options are A 1 chapter, B 1 chapter, C 1 chapter, D 1 chapter. Author's note: to be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Cheat.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 498. Carglass brought good news for Bosley and Tamar. To be exact, he brought back a new set of archer's armor. The archer's armor was modified from the Crimson Banner cavalry's armor. The surface had been polished and engraved with patterns, making it look completely different from the half-finished archer's armor. Carglass placed the new set of archer's armor on the table. The new set of archer's armor was dark green in color, and the light patterns on it were said to be based on the aesthetic style of the tree elves. The archer's armor shone brightly under the sunlight that penetrated through the stained glass ceiling of the hall. It looked like a piece of jade art, but compared to the original, Brando noticed that the new archer's armor had an additional long feather cloak. The cloak was not only added for aesthetic reasons, but also to reduce the overall weight of the archer's armor without increasing the cost. Erwin's master forger and the future master alchemist had thought of many ways to reduce the weight of the archer's armor. In the end, they came up with a clever idea, and that was to add an additional magic cloak to the archer's armor. This cloak was actually enchanted with a spell similar to Wind Feather. Wind Feather was a level 1 spell of the wind element. It could slightly increase the speed of the target and allow the target to float. Carglass even brought 2 female tree elves to demonstrate, and the results were excellent. Although the 2 tree elves were unavoidably clumsy after putting on the magic armor, it was definitely worth it compared to the increase in defense it brought. Moreover, after activating the magic cloak, it was as if wings had sprouted from their backs, and they could leap up and down from wall to wall. Brando thought that the design of the cloak was a stroke of genius, especially when the 2 tree elves put on the new emerald armor and pulled up the hood of their cloaks, revealing their pointed chins. They held longbows in their hands, and the edges of their cloaks drooped down to the ground. His eyes almost popped out of their sockets. It was said that the Silver Elves had a legendary army called Lin Ge's Blade, and they were also dressed in the same way. The Lin Ge's Blade had silver robes and silver bows, and the Tree Elves' archers did not pale in comparison. Medisha seemed to be in a daze. She looked at the 2 tree elves in front of her and suddenly asked, "My lord, can I lead this army?" Brando did not expect Medisha, who had always been aloof from worldly affairs, to take the initiative to ask, "Medisha. They're elves." I know. Medisha, she lowered her head and said, "I'm sorry. My lord." Brendel looked at him and suddenly remembered something. "You used to be the commander of Lin Ge's Blade." Medisha. And Medisha. Amazing, Medisa. Brendel praised. The Lin Ji's blade was the strongest army in the Silver Elven Empire. It had been the strongest archer army in Wone for centuries. Medisha being their commander was something to be proud of. But this silver elf girl had never mentioned it. Brando did not even know that she knew archery. Thank you. Medisha's face turned red as she replied in a small voice. You're a silver elf. You've experienced the War of the Holy Saints. The tree elf girl's eyes lit up in disbelief. She immediately looked at Brando. My lord, she's the commander of the Silver Elves. Can you let her teach us? Brando was stunned. He was still thinking that Medisha, the Silver Fairy Princess, had hidden her abilities well. He did not expect the Tree Elves to give him another surprise. This was because the commander of the Tree Elves also held the position of archery instructor. If the Tree Elves wanted Medisha to teach them, it meant that they wanted Medisha to lead them. In theory, the Tree Elves were his allies. Even if he wanted to appoint a commander, he would need their permission first. But this was too much of an initiative. Brando felt a little awkward, of course. But what about Mr. Quinn? The Tree Elf leader, Quinn, had returned to the Green Tower after the war ended. However, all the Tree Elves and Druids he brought with him remained in his territory. Brando had full authority over the Tree Elves, but Quinn was still the commander of this army. Mr. Quinn, it's fine, the Tree Elf girl shook her head and smiled. Mr. Quinn has already passed his position to me. I can make the decisions. You are. Brando looked at her curiously. The Tree Elf girl smiled. She already knew this young human lord, but Brando didn't. She extended her hand and smiled. Finny, I'm the leader of the archers. Nice to meet you, my lord. Her human etiquette startled Brando. He had never seen such an extroverted tree elf. In his mind, the Tree Elves were a simple and cautious race. However, Brando still extended his hand and shook Finny's hand. If that's the case. He hesitated for a moment before replying, then I'll entrust Medisha to you. She's my best subordinate. I hope you can work well together. Of course. I never dreamed that a hero who experienced the War of the Holy Saints would lead us. Finny said happily. Hero. Brando looked at Medisha in confusion. Although this Silver Fairy Princess was outstanding in all aspects, whether it was etiquette or the way she treated others, he still found it hard to associate her with the word hero. No matter how he looked at it, Medisha was still like a human girl who hadn't grown up yet. No matter how calm and mature she was still like a little sister in his eyes. The Silver Elf girl smiled faintly at him. Lady Medisha, may I ask how old you are now? Did you experience the War of the Lilies? Finny asked curiously. Medisha looked at Brando. I'm actually in a spiritual state. Before the War of the Lilies, I had already returned to my ancient homeland in hibernation. If it wasn't for my lord, I would still be under the influence of the dark forces. But Sir Lord woke me up, just like the call of fate. I'm sorry, I didn't know you were all ready. Finny didn't expect Medisha to have died long ago. She looked at her with sympathy. You must be a heroic spirit now, right? I heard that heroic spirits will assist wise kings. The archer captain couldn't help but look at Brando. Ahem, it's not that ridiculous. Brando immediately coughed loudly. That's just a legend. He had always believed that he transmigrated to this world to make up for his regrets. His greatest hope now was to help the future Princess Griffin revive Erwin. As for Finny's unintentional words, he didn't even think about it. The throne was an unimaginable temptation to the greedy nobles of Erwin, but it was nothing more than a burden to him. But back to the topic at hand, he was very satisfied with the archer armor that Bosley and Tamar had created. As expected of future grandmasters, this improved magic armor was impeccable in every aspect: winged archer armor defense, force 5, arrow resistance +2, weight reduction 20%, wings of wind, recharge in 10 minutes, grants temporary levitation upon activation, agility +10%, evasion +5%. Lasts for 10 seconds. Although the addition of a magic cloak wasn't cheap, it was still much easier than adding 3 layers of magic circles to the armor. Moreover, the magic cloak gave a huge boost to dexterity by 10% and evasion by 5%. Although it only lasted for a short 10 seconds, it was easy to imagine how much damage a tree elf archer would suffer if he suddenly activated this ability while being approached by cavalry or infantry. Presumably, their opponents would be shocked. The cost of the armor was around 2,000 tor, and 300 sets would be around 600,000 tor. With Brando's current output, it would only take him half a year to fully equip the tree elves with Schaflund's silver mines. However, the benefits of the tree elf archers equipped with the new equipment would definitely far exceed the investment of 600,000 tor. Money could still be earned, but special forces were as rare as nests in wound. Brando firmly believed that good steel should be spent on the blade's edge. Moreover, the magic crystal mine would soon be put into operation. The Dark Forest could produce 3 standard units of magic crystals per day, and it was considered a super-rich mine. Even though the magic ores are currently being used up by the territory, I believe that it will soon be full. I'm preparing to sell the excess magic ores to the outside world. After all, these magic ores are used as hard currency in any era in the Amber Sword's history, and this will be a huge fortune. A standard production of magic crystals per day was 1 flame-patterned agate, or 10 lesser moon crystals. In the long run, Brando didn't think that he would always be short on money. Once the Dark Forest was developed, it would be a huge fortune, but what he needed was a strong army to protect the wealth that belonged to Erwin. "Excuse me, my lord." At this time, Carglass finally shifted his gaze away from the light spirits flying up and down in the hall. He always felt that his choice to follow Brando was the wisest decision because there were so many new and interesting things around him. Of course, only Brando could tolerate his captain's attention being diverted to irrelevant things during a serious discussion. For example, when Carglass was telling jokes to Monica, Brando pretended not to see it. If it was any other Lord of Aween or Kurlutz in this era, they would have kicked Carglass out of the hall and asked him to reflect on how he had violated the rules of nobility. However, Brando was undoubtedly the most suitable master for Carglass. He only asked, "Is there anything else, Carglass?" "Of course," Carglass replied, "I have a letter for you, my lord." "A letter for me?" Brando was stunned. His men wouldn't write him a letter for no reason. The only person who would write him a letter could only be that person. He looked at the letter that Carglass took out and couldn't help but stare blankly. What did the princess in history write to him this time? "P.S. Unfortunately, I was delayed by some matters. Fortunately, I still managed to write a chapter. So, today's update is too late. I apologize to everyone, I'm sorry. If I remember correctly, there are still 4 more chapters to go. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 499. You yearn for Erwin's flag, but as the daughter of King Oberg and the princess of the royal family, I cannot answer you. My lord, you have fulfilled your promise in Tonajul, and you have set a good example. Now that the north is filled with rebels, and the kingdom is on the verge of collapse, as a direct descendant of the House of Corvado, I cannot back down. I am grateful for your trust. If hope still exists in Erwin, then it must be in our hearts. This letter is to give you an answer. I promise to change this kingdom, even if it costs me everything. Princess Griffin Corvado gently closed the letter, her face calm, as if her worries did not exist in this decaying ship that was about to sink. However, this was only the calm before the storm. The storm was gathering in the sky, and it was about to set off a raging wave. There was a knock on the door, and a servant in a red robe asked the princess for the third time. The carriage was already waiting outside the palace, and Oberwe, Makarov, and the other important officials had been waiting for a long time. The meeting with Duke Erek was imminent. In the current Awin, there was no one else as important as this person who could change the balance of the entire balance of the balance. Griffin did not expect the young people in Vladipes to change the situation, and now Erwin only had the army loyal to Vernon that could contend against the alliance of the northern dukes. It was not that her half-brother did not try to rope Erek into his camp, but he could not offer such a high price. Griffin knew the old fox's plan. He needed her to give birth to an heir with royal blood to legally take over Erwin's throne. Ever since the 10 Years' Edict, the family had been plotting for this position for a long time. However, she would rather have blood flowing in front of the throne than allow such a thing to happen. Those who betrayed the sacred oath could never inherit the glorious flag, and this was a stain on the oath of the Lionheart. Furthermore, Erek had been secretly involved with the All-for-One for many years. They thought they were foolproof, but this kind of thing could never be kept secret. The half-elf princess, who was still in her teenage years, couldn't help but curl her lips into a tight arc. There was a kind of silent mockery in her eyes. It was almost the season where the snow melted, and if they continued to delay, Erek would be pushed to the other side. She was the princess of the royal family, and she had already made her choice. Griffin lowered her head, and stretched out her slender fingers, and gently stroked the soft hair on her brother's forehead. Sister. Erwin's future heir looked up, and under the light of the mutton fat candle, he looked uneasily at his sister. You will be the king, Haruz, the princess said. I know. You said it before, I'm the king of Awin. The boy replied. Yes, Griffin's sister said. No one can change the countries for the revival, Ives. Griffin's for the future, but you must be strong for one to be strong. She looked up, and her silver eyes seemed to have seen through the storm in front of her, and saw a gloomy ending. Assassinations, conspiracies, and a bloody rose on the throne. But after the storm, there must be new life on the land. Yes, I've become stronger, and I practice swordsmanship every day. The boy looked up and saw the letter in his sister's hand. Sister, who are you writing to? A knight. I'm going to be a knight in the future. After a year of wandering and leaving the royal family, the boy had learned to be sharp and cunning. He looked at his sister, the princess. They said you're going to amp your seal. Yes. What will I do if you go? You should learn to make some decisions by yourself. Do you remember what I told you? You're a man, Haruz, you have to take the helm. Griffin replied. Oh, the boy was a little disappointed. Then you have to come back soon, or there will be no one to test my swordsmanship. Griffin couldn't help but smile. Her weak brother had learned to beat around the bush. The future successor of Awin seemed to want to continue this topic, but he hesitated and stuttered. Him. I'm talking about that knight. Will he protect you? What are you trying to say? Griffin glared at her brother. She was very scary when she was angry, and the boy couldn't help but shrink back. I don't want you to marry Duke Erek. Why? Griffin was a little surprised. Her cowardly brother wouldn't say such things to her. She couldn't help but suspect that someone was telling him to say such things, but it didn't seem to be necessary. Whether it was Makarov or her teacher, the wise old man, they all hoped to get Erek's help. They could see the poison behind the honey, but their motives were clear. Griffin didn't want to reject their wishful thinking, because at least she still needed the support of the nobles. Erwin was still Erwin of the nobles. The boy shook his head. I don't like him. Why? You haven't seen him before. No. I've heard. The boy stared at her and said hesitantly. What did you hear? They said that Duke Aurek had a few wives, and they all died. They said that the Duke is a vampire who drinks the blood of women. Sister. The boy's aura of being Erwin's future successor faded, and he became an ordinary and cowardly boy. He looked at his sister anxiously. Nonsense. Griffin reprimanded. But this reprimand was a little weak. The boy sensed that with his sister's personality, she wouldn't care if it was nonsense. But he didn't understand what marriage meant to a 16-year-old girl. Even if she accepted it, she was still afraid of the unknown. At this time, the servant knocked on the door for the 4th time. The firm knocking seemed to balance the stone in her heart. She took a deep breath and became firm again. Griffin touched Haru's forehead. She stood up, and a maid combed her hair and wrinkles in her clothes. The princess stretched out her hands, overcoming all external factors, and didn't let the calmness of the Covardo family go out of shape. This was her choice. When she went out, a young knight from the Royal Academy said in a low voice, "Your Highness, even if you stay in the Academy, we are willing to fight to the death. The glory of the Erwin royal family doesn't need to bend over a treacherous person." But Griffin looked back and replied calmly, "Erwin doesn't need to shed the blood of the future, because that time hasn't come yet." Then she lifted her skirt and walked into the carriage, leaving behind a thin figure. But it was these weak shoulders that in the near future, would carry the hope of Erwin's revival. Brando gently closed the letter with his thumb and forefinger and sighed softly. It was as if time had turned back, and this moment had returned to the starting point of everything. This was the moment that would decide Owen's future. The stage it played in the past had not changed today, but who could be sure where the future would lead? Erwin's hope lies in our hearts. He repeated this sentence a few times, but his heart was also at a loss. Erwin's hope existed in the hearts of everyone who fought for it, but dreams couldn't change everything. He had personally experienced the pain of powerlessness. This time, he had to take control of his own fate. Carglass stood aside and looked at his lord. He had never seen such an expression on Brando's face. The young lord had always been calm and confident. He wanted to see what was written in the letter in Brando's hand, but unfortunately, he couldn't. The letter was magically processed, and he could only see a blank page. Whose letter is this? He couldn't help but ask. It's a letter from Princess Griffin. She was very pleased with how we embarrassed the Earl in Tonajol. Brando recovered in an instant. After experiencing so many dangers and hardships, he had grown up and was no longer the Sophie who was easily swayed by emotions. Carglass looked at his lord suspiciously. I won't be fooled this time. If the princess would write a letter to rebels like us, then wouldn't those who were hanged on Pine Avenue from Anwar be loyal and righteous? Brando couldn't help but look at him when he heard Carglass comparing himself to those bandits. Didn't I say that I'm the princess' secret knight? Then I'm the dark dragon's attendant. Carglass didn't think much of it. Brando opened his mouth and stared at him in shock. What's wrong? No, I'm thinking, did you secretly learn astrology from Amandina? You're not going to say that I guessed right again, are you? You can't fool me with this old trick. Carglass suddenly felt that his lord was too interesting. He actually said that he was the dark dragon. Carglass thought that it was an extremely clever joke. But no matter how clever the joke was, it was interrupted by the tinkling of bells. Brando looked up and saw a few silver orchids swaying on the wall of the hall. He turned around and looked at Monique. Those are communication orchids. Someone is approaching from outside, my lord. Monique sat on his shoulder and said. Why wasn't there before? We planted them. Valhalla is also the home of the light spirits. We plan to plant some more chandelier orchids later. Brando caught a glimpse of his attendant at the entrance of the hall. The Shire held a staff in his hand and wore a red gilded robe. Behind him was the cowering Mordenkainen holding his duck familiar. This place is not bad. It's similar to your old home in Dardanelle, my lord. The Shire walked into the hall calmly and looked around. He raised his staff and praised. My old home in Dardanelle. Brando's teeth ached. The Highland Knight's White Knight was stationed in Dardanelle. But when he looked at his attendant's serious face, he almost thought that he had an old home in Karsuk. He stared at the Shire in annoyance, but the young Highland wizard ignored him and bowed to him. Congratulations, my lord. It's been a long and arduous journey, but now we finally have a place to stand. Congratulations, I have another piece of good news for you. Good news? You'd better take a look at this, my lord. The Shire took out an item. Brando immediately stood up from behind the desk. The cards of fate. I'll go out and come back at night to continue. I know many people say that I don't plan well and that I don't inform you when I'm doing something. Well, that's a flaw that deserves to be criticized. Well, I'm just a little aimless. I'll try my best to pay more attention in the future. To be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidien. Calm to vote. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 500. The exquisite card was gray with cloud patterns. It had a golden edge and was as thin as a feather. It was painted with the towering walls of the black city of Ludsai and the volcano as the background. Brando put it down, and the sunlight that had been blocked out was able to shine through the skylight. It was cut into a pool of golden fragments and sprinkled on the wizard's crimson robe opposite him. Icronia's Furnace of Adversity, Paradise of Adversity 3, any 30, Barrier, Lair. When the furnace enters the field, attach it to the land card. Tap, any 2. Sacrifice an Icronia soldier to give the furnace 2 points of energy. When travelers pass through the Great Plains, the Ludsai volcano in the north is shrouded in dark clouds all day long. This is a group of mercenaries founded at the entrance of the underground city. They knew that my men were looking for something similar, so they sent it over. The underground city is in the mountains near the silver mine. I suspect that there will be more cards of fate there. The Shire used telepathy to communicate. This card should be created by a planeswalker called Kelsey. He was one of the most outstanding planeswalkers in the past 3,000 years. He created a dark world called the Plains of Icronia. Icronia's Adversity is a very famous set of black and white cards. This card is part of the set and is used in conjunction with the other cards. Brando looked at his wizard attendant. Why haven't I heard you mention this before? I only found out recently, after I leveled up. The Shire shrugged. Is this set of cards very powerful? Of course. Icronia is one of the best planeswalkers in history. If we can find his legacy, we'll be rich, the Shire replied. Brando was not so optimistic. In the past, there were many underground cities in Shaflund, but this did not change the fact that this was a newbie area. The underground ruins of the ruined dwarves in the Shaflund silver mine were a special case. The value of the treasures in other places was still a question. You didn't go deeper. The mercenaries only went near the entrance. The room behind was filled with silt and was difficult to continue. From the looks of it, it should be a tomb that doesn't belong to our era. Sealed-off area. Brando's interest was piqued. Sealed areas were often unexplored dungeons. The first exploration would yield good results. However, the card in his hand seemed to have formed an indissoluble bond with the tomb. Wouldn't that mean that he would have to change his class to become a tomb raider in the future? Then let's go take a look. How did you get here? The conversation between the two only lasted for a moment, and only Folair knew about it. The others only felt that the hall had quieted down. Then they saw Brando raise his head and sweep his gaze across the entire hall. "Of course it's the carriage, my lord." The Shire smiled. Brando nodded and looked at Carglass. "I'm here." "What's the matter?" Carglass, who was distracted as usual, snapped back to reality and looked at him. Brando felt pain in the corner of his eyes. "As one of the most serious nobles in Erewhon, it's really fortunate that your father didn't kick you out of the house." The young man laughed and scratched his head. "Prepare a ship for Ampere Seal." "A ship for Ampere Seal?" Carglass reacted quickly. "I'm going to Ampere Seal." "My lord, do you have any orders for me?" he asked with a smile. "It's not you, it's me." "What?" "My lord, you're leaving Abes for Ampere Seal." "Why?" "You talk too much." "Are you going or not?" Brando asked in annoyance. This guy was one of the best young men in Tonagel in all aspects, but he was so lazy that it gave people a headache. He couldn't help but pity Sir Maxon. That old man must have been furious a lot. Carglass shrugged. "Of course I'm going. Why wouldn't I go? This is my lord's order. A merchant ship for Ampere Seal." "I understand. I'll tell them it's just a group of ordinary guests." "That's more like it." Brando turned back to look at Fanny. "Do you like this place?" He had already heard the conversation between the tree elf girl and Medisha. Fanny nodded. The tree elf archers were left behind by the druids to stay in Abes for a long time. They also wanted to find a suitable place to live. "But Valhalla isn't big enough." "It's fine. It doesn't matter if it's nearby, my lord," the female elf archer said generously. Her words reminded Brando of something. He had the idea of moving the residents of the Green Village over. The Erewhon people in the territory were still unable to receive the Senia people, and they couldn't stay in the sawmill for too long. He asked the Silver Fairy Princess to handle this matter. Medisha was now the commander of the Tree Elves, and she had the ability to do so. After arranging everything, Brando followed the Shire into the carriage, followed by Scarlet and the Roman. Scarlet was always by his side, as if she could only feel safe by his side. The little Roman was the same. He was like a little burden. The underground city was located in a valley. It took 3 hours to travel from Schaflund, and there were no roads nearby. Thus, the group had to walk through the lush forest for half a day before the Emerald Valley appeared in front of them. The valley faced north and south, connected by rolling hills. There was a stream below, and there were a few scattered tents in the forest on both sides. The Shire's apprentices and a group of mercenaries were stationed here to prevent local adventurers from getting there first. The person in charge of this group was the young magus whose companion was killed by Grodin. He was born in a noble family, but after Grodin's death, he stayed in the Shire to learn magic. He changed his name to Lillian, a name he had forgotten. Today, he was one of the most outstanding apprentices in the Shire. The young magus bowed respectfully to Brando. Brando had seen him before, and he had a deep impression of his silent, angry eyes. But at this moment, there was only humility. "My lord, the tomb is at the bottom of the valley. It's buried in the mountains, and there are only a few round pillars outside." The mercenaries dug a tunnel that leads directly to the tomb. The tunnel is about 50 meters deep, and it leads to 3 vertical cellars. There's a lot of silt in there, and it's difficult to enter. I ordered my men to use detection magic and metal in the area outside, but they didn't find anything. Lillian explained clearly. Brando was pleasantly surprised. It was easy to find a dozen experienced mercenaries in Tonagel, but it was rare to find someone who was smart and knowledgeable. These people were either monks from the Holy Cathedral or nobles. It was fortunate that they didn't cause trouble for him. As he listened, he looked up and observed the surroundings. The stream in the valley would rise during the rainy season, and it should be able to reach their location. Thus, he deduced that the silt in the tomb was from the river. However, he didn't care too much about Lillian's explanation. The cards of fate couldn't be detected by magic, and only planeswalkers could. Didn't you dig through the silt? No, my lord. There's a magic barrier behind the silt. We tried all kinds of methods, but we couldn't open it. Lillian replied with some difficulty. A magic barrier. Brando was interested. Bring me to see it. As you wish, my lord. The young magus bowed and replied. The entrance to the tomb was at the other end of the camp. As they walked through the camp, the mercenaries looked at Brando with admiration. They knew that this young lord was someone who didn't fear authority. He dared to go against Count Randall just because of a promise he made to a little girl. As for Count Randall's reaction, there were still many nobles waiting to be ransomed in the dungeons of Abes. The news of him killing two of Count Randall's gold-ranked swordsmen with 2 strikes of his sword had spread throughout the kingdom. This is a real man. Everyone thought so when they saw Brando at this moment. However, Brando was surprised to see the female mercenary leader in the camp. The red-haired and blue-eyed Yuta wore a white shirt and tight trousers that outlined the curves of her lower body. She wore a wide belt and a pair of long riding boots, making her look like a female pirate. She tied her warhorse to a tree and swung her long hair back. She was slightly surprised when she saw Brando. Ah, the mines are too boring. I heard that there's a tomb here, so I came to take a look. I didn't expect to be discovered the first time I slacked off. My luck is really bad. Yuta looked around. Some of the mercenaries were originally her subordinates. But your prestige is getting higher and higher, my lord. Brendel coughed. This female mercenary leader's figure was a little too hot. She was wearing a shirt, and half of her snow-white and full half of her breasts were exposed. It was almost tearing the shirt apart. Even Seal had a hard time averting his gaze from that cleavage, let alone Brendel. How exciting! The Shire couldn't help but sigh in relief. Brando did not know whether to laugh or cry. Most of his subordinates were dressed in a messy manner. The mercenaries and adventurers still followed their old habits. Now that his prestige was high, it was time to unify their battle robes. The Erewhon Kingdom's military uniform was dark blue. The private soldiers of the Erewhon Kingdom had their own habits, and most of them were based on their family emblem. However, Brando had other ideas. He nodded at Yuta. It's fine. Since the female leader is interested, why don't we go together? Of course, Yuta smiled, but my lord is too polite. I'm willing to be your knight. You can just call me by my name. Brando looked at her. Knight? Retainer. He could faintly feel the deeper meaning behind Yuta's words. The female mercenary leader was very carefree. Ever since Count Randner's defeat, she had completely submitted to him. Being able to follow a good lord was the dream of every mercenary. Even though she did not know Cornelius and Rabin's thoughts, she was sure that they were the same. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.